Chapter 21:19. The most important factor was Chu Fengmian's cultivation level. Even though a half-step celestial realm demon immortal was powerful, his aura was completely different from that of a celestial realm expert. After passing the celestial tribulation, a celestial realm demon immortal would have a unique aura, which was also a sign of ascending to immortality. Even though Chu Fengmian's current strength was far stronger than most immortal realm experts and even immortal warrior realm demon immortals, it still couldn't make up for this. Therefore, as long as a celestial realm expert saw Chu Fengmian, they could clearly see that Chu Fengmian was still a half-step celestial realm expert. However, it didn't have much of an impact. When Martial Ghost Old Ancestor activated the array diagram to probe Chu Fengmian's background, Chu Fengmian reacted in an instant and hid his figure. Therefore, even though Martial Ghost Old Ancestor had probed Chu Fengmian's background, it was still very vague and difficult to judge Chu Fengmian's true strength. He could only be sure that Chu Fengmian wasn't as strong as they thought. Although this was a small accident for Chu Fengmian's plan, it didn't affect anything. I don't know the origin of this immortal array diagram. I feel that the aura of this immortal array diagram is very similar to that of the God-spying mirror. Is there some connection? Chu Fengmian looked at Martial Ghost Old Ancestor from afar. The immortal array diagram attracted Chu Fengmian's attention. This kind of spiritual tool that could detect aura was extremely rare, let alone an immortal tool. The Heavenly Dao sect had once walked the furthest on this path. Heavenly Dao sect was once the most glorious sect in the 9 regions. It was the only sect that had ever chosen the 10 great ancient immortal techniques in the name of Heavenly Dao. It had created countless legends. If this immortal array diagram was related to Heavenly Dao sect, it was definitely a supreme treasure. Its value was far higher than that of an immortal tool. Martial Ghost Old Ancestor wasn't from the 9 regions and didn't know the history of the 9 regions as well as Chu Fengmian. Therefore, it was possible that he didn't know the true origin of this immortal array diagram and couldn't exert the true power of this immortal array diagram. Immortal artifacts were different from spiritual artifacts. For some immortal artifacts, if one did not know their origins, one would not be able to unleash their true power. Just like the Life Seal, only those who had cultivated the Life Emperor technique and gathered the Life Emperor force could unleash the greatest power of the Life Seal. Originally, Chu Fengmian had lured Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi over to deal with Tianqing Jiandi. His goal was Tianqing Jiandi's Supreme Sword Qi. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the Supreme Sword Qi, even if he did not kill them, he only needed to retreat unscathed. Chu Fengmian had such a plan from the beginning. Given Chu Fengmian's current strength, it was definitely not a good choice to fight Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi head-on. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the several hundred strands of Supreme Sword Qi in Tianqing Jiandi's hands and refined them, his strength would advance by leaps and bounds. At that time, it would not be too late to chase after these two people. However, the moment he saw the immortal artifact array diagram in Martial Ghost Patriarch's hands, Chu Fengmian's mind suddenly changed. This immortal artifact array diagram was as important as the Supreme Sword Qi. If this immortal artifact array diagram was truly related to the Heavenly Path sect, then it would be a priceless treasure. As the most glorious sect in the history of the 9 regions, very few of the Heavenly Path sect's ruins had appeared. It was only by chance that some spiritual artifacts and treasures of the Tiandao sect could be found in the ruins of the sect. However, the real ruins of the Tiandao sect had never appeared. Any spiritual artifact or immortal artifact related to the Tiandao sect could be related to the inheritance of the Tiandao sect. It could be said to be priceless. Therefore, today, Chu Fengmian would not only obtain the Supreme Sword Qi, but also the immortal artifact array diagram. Martial Ghost Patriarch examined the immortal artifact array diagram several times with no results. He also stopped, knowing that Chu Fengmian had hidden himself. That kid must have some kind of spiritual artifact on him. It might even be an immortal artifact that can conceal his aura. I can't detect his location, but I can confirm that he must be hiding in the returning ruined sky. To be able to escape detection, this kid has some tricks up his sleeve. Tianqing Jiandi was slightly surprised to hear this result. He had also seen the power of the Immortal Artifact Array diagram in Martial Ghost Patriarch's hands. Once someone got close to it, even immortal generals would not be able to escape detection. This time, Chu Fengmian had actually escaped detection. Don't worry, the returning ruined sky is only so big. If we search bit by bit, it won't take long for us to find that kid. Moreover, my spirit-seeking map has already captured a bit of his aura. As long as he dares to use his spiritual energy, I will be able to detect it immediately. Martial Ghost Patriarch said confidently. He had already confirmed that Chu Fengmian was in the returning ruined sky, so it was only a matter of time before he found him. Moreover, with the spirit-seeking map, he was not worried that Chu Fengmian would take the opportunity to escape. In his opinion, Chu Fengmian was already trapped in the returning ruined sky. If he continued to hide, he would only be caught. Come, let's search together. Martial Ghost Patriarch said, then called out to Tianqing Jiandi. The two of them searched the returning ruined sky for traces of Chu Fengmian. Both of them were immortal generals. Their spiritual senses could cover a radius of dozens of miles. Everything hidden within dozens of miles would be discovered by them. Although the returning ruined sky wasn't small, it wouldn't take them a long time to explore it. So cautious. In the ruins of chaos, Chu Fengmian frowned when he saw Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi working together to search for him. The two of them were obviously very cautious people. Even if they knew that Chu Fengmian was not as strong as he seemed, they still worked together to search for him. Chu Fengmian originally wanted to defeat them one by one. Facing one immortal general alone was much easier than facing two immortal generals at the same time. But now that Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi were so cautious, Chu Fengmian did not have the opportunity to do so. I have no choice but to make a move. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed with cold killing intent as he muttered to himself. He knew very well that waiting for the absorption would not give him any chance, so he might as well make a move now. This time, Chu Fengmian had set up a trap and was fully prepared. Even if it was 1 against 2, Chu Fengmian was still confident. Sword. Chu Fengmian's mind moved and suddenly communicated with the 1,800 Supreme Sword Qi. These 1,800 Supreme Sword Qi were now drifting in the ruins of chaos, and Chu Fengmian's spiritual power was injected into them. These 1,800 Supreme Sword Qi burst out with a tyrannical sword intent. End of chapter. Chapter 21-20. This is the Supreme Sword Qi. Supreme Sword Qi is actually hidden in the returning ruined sky. In the returning ruined sky, Ancestor Wuguei and Tianqing Jiandi were searching one of the continents. There were dozens of such continents in the returning ruined sky. Suddenly, the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's figure stopped in the air. He withdrew his spiritual consciousness and used all his strength to sense something. Then, a look of ecstasy appeared on Tianqing Jiandi's face. It's the Supreme Sword Qi. It's really the Supreme Sword Qi. I've long heard that the Supreme Sword Qi is hidden in the returning ruined sky. The last time I came, I couldn't find it. I didn't expect to sense a little bit of the Supreme Sword Qi this time. Is this my fortuitous encounter? I have a total of 900 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. If I can obtain another 100 strands of Supreme Sword Qi and gather 1,000 strands, the power of the Supreme Sword Qi will increase by countless times. Even just one Supreme Sword Qi will greatly increase the power of the Supreme Sword Qi. Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor muttered to himself as he revealed an extremely excited expression. He had also obtained the Supreme Sword Qi by chance. As his strength grew, the number of Supreme Sword Qi in his hands also increased. Now, he had a total of 900 Supreme Sword Qi in his hands. Although there was still a long way to go before he could reach 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi, it was difficult for most sword cultivators to obtain 1 or 2 Supreme Sword Qi. Tianqing Jiandi had 900 of them. As Tianqing Jiandi's strength grew, he could see how powerful the Supreme Sword Qi was. It was definitely much more powerful than an immortal weapon. The Supreme Sword Qi was not just its power. The sword techniques and sword intent contained in it were the most important treasures for a sword cultivator. If Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor could obtain even more Supreme Sword Chi, he would be able to comprehend the sword arts and sword intent within it. Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's strength would increase by another level. His strength had already reached the pinnacle of the immortal general realm. If he took another step forward, he would step into the profound heaven realm and become an immortal marquis. At that time, he would even be able to control the entire 100 Extreme Starfield Alliance and become the master of the alliance. This huge benefit made the people of Tianqing Jiandi tremble with excitement. Unparalleled Sword Chi? You really found unparalleled Sword Chi? Old Ancestor Gui Wu also came over and said in surprise when he heard Tianqing Jiandi talking to himself. Of course, he knew what kind of treasure this Supreme Sword Chi was. It was the ultimate treasure of the sword principle. Tianqing Jiandi was said to be an invincible giant in the alliance of the 100 Extreme Star Regions. Tianqing Jiandi was even stronger than him because of this Supreme Sword Chi. Sword cultivators who possessed Supreme Sword Chi could be said to be invincible in the same realm in terms of strength. This was especially true for Supreme Sword Chi. 3,000 of them were a single entity. If a person obtained more Supreme Sword Chi, the power they could unleash would increase exponentially. Let's go first. I'll help you collect those Supreme Sword Chi first. After that, we'll continue to search for that kid. Anyway, he's in the returning ruined sky. He can't run away. Old Ancestor Gui Wu made a prompt decision. Supreme Sword Chi was the ultimate treasure of the sword principle. Once it appeared, it would attract the attention of countless experts. Even some experts who were not sword cultivators would go to fight for it. If they obtained Supreme Sword Chi, they could sell it to some sword cultivators for a sky-high price. The first thing they did when they found out was to collect it. Let's go! Tianqing Jiandi shouted coldly. The two of them rose into the air and left the continent. Over there! Streaks of sword light emerged from the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's body. These streaks of sword light turned into spiritual swords and guarded the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor. These spiritual swords were Supreme Sword Chi. There were a total of 900 Supreme Sword Chi. Now, all of them appeared beside Tianqing Jiandi, guiding him forward. The two of them flew for a full 10 minutes. The surrounding scenery became more and more desolate. The stars and continents had all disappeared. It was incomparably silent. This is the edge of the returning ruined sky. Is the Supreme Sword Chi hidden here? Old Ancestor Gui Wu said with a frown as he looked around. That's right. I have Supreme Sword Chi. I can't be wrong about the aura of the Supreme Sword Chi. I can already feel the sword will. The Supreme Sword Chi is not far away. Tianqing Jiandi was extremely excited. He sped up. A few figures flickered and finally, the two of them stopped in front of a patch of chaos. Is this the chaotic ruins? The two of them involuntarily came to a halt when they saw Hun Dun in front of them. A grave expression appeared on their faces. Old Ancestor Gui Wu looked at the chaos in front of him and said with a grim expression. The chaotic ruins is a famous dangerous place in the returning ruined sky. It is said that the chaos contains ancient poisonous gas and miasma. Once it enters one's body, one will die without a doubt. There is no cure. Many powerhouses from the extraterritorial starry sky had ventured into the chaotic ruins. However, they either fled in panic or died in the ruins. Old Ancestor Gui Wu had heard of the dangers in there. Therefore, they stopped at the edge of the chaotic ruins and did not dare to go any closer. I can feel that the Supreme Sword Chi is inside, and there are more than one or two Supreme Sword Chi inside. Tianqing Jiandi's gaze fell on the chaotic ruins. Even under the cover of the chaos, Tianqing Jiandi could still see the sword light. There were hundreds of them. Hundreds of Supreme Sword Chi. Seeing this scene, Tianqing Jiandi's eyes were burning. Even the legendary dangers of the chaotic ruins could not stop him. He already had 900 strands of Supreme Sword Chi. If he obtained another 600 strands of Supreme Sword Chi, he would have more than 1,500 strands of Supreme Sword Chi. By then, he would not be afraid even if he encountered other existences with Supreme Sword Chi. Once he surpassed the number of Supreme Sword Chi, he would be able to suppress the opponent. If he could control 1,500 Supreme Sword Chi, he would have a great chance of collecting 3,000 Supreme Sword Chi in the future. Thinking of this, Tianqing Jiandi's eyes became even more burning. Wealth comes from danger. Let's go in. The chaotic spiritual chi in the chaotic ruins is indeed highly toxic. However, with our strength, it should not be a problem to hold on for an hour. Let's go and collect some Supreme Sword Chi first. If we encounter any danger, we will retreat. Tianqing Jiandi said. The Supreme Sword Chi was right in front of him. Even if he knew that there was danger, he could not give up. End of chapter. Chapter 21-21. Tianqing Jiandi and Martial Ghost Patriarch did not hesitate and stepped into the Primal Chaos Ruins together. After entering the Primal Chaos Ruins, the two of them condensed their immortal energy and formed a layer of barrier to protect them from the miasma and poison in the Primal Chaos Ruins. They had heard of the dangers of the Primal Chaos Ruins. Now that they had entered it, they were naturally very careful. They did not want to fall into the Primal Chaos Ruins. The moment Tianqing Jiandi entered the Primal Chaos Ruins, he was blinded by countless dazzling sword lights. These sword lights were connected to form a net, as if the entire Primal Chaos Ruins was filled with Supreme Sword Chi. Just by looking at the Supreme Sword Chi, there were hundreds of them. Furthermore, the Supreme Sword Chi was still drifting in the Primal Chaos Ruins, revealing even more Supreme Sword Chi. Clearly, the number of Supreme Sword Chi far exceeded this number. How can there be so many Supreme Sword Chi? The Heavenly Saint's sword was stunned. He had originally thought that there would only be around 100 strands of Supreme Sword Chi in the Primal Chaos Ruins. However, after entering the Primal Chaos Ruins, the number of strands of Supreme Sword Chi far exceeded his expectations. There are hundreds, no, thousands of Supreme Sword Chi. How can there be so many? Tianqing Jiandi's voice was filled with disbelief. As an immortal general expert, he felt that the scene before him was a blur. That was over 1,000 strands of Supreme Sword Chi. After all, the 900 strands of Supreme Sword Chi in his possession had all been obtained through many life and death battles. He had obtained them from others. But now, the number of Supreme Sword Chi in the Primal Chaos Ruins was much more than what he had. After the shock, Tianqing Jiandi's face was filled with ecstasy. The more Supreme Sword Chi he obtained, the greater the power he could unleash. If he could obtain so many Supreme Sword Chi, his strength would rise to an unimaginable level. Not only would he be able to sweep through the 100 Extremes Alliance, but he would also be able to sweep through all the major forces in the 9 domains. In the future, he might even have the chance to dominate the 9 domains and become the Lord of the Sacred Region. His whole body was trembling with excitement. Brother Tianqing, let's collect these Supreme Sword Chis first. We can't stay here for long. Ancestor Gui Wu, who was standing at the side, appeared to be much calmer as he hastily reminded. This sentence also startled Tianqing Jiandi. All right, let's work together to collect them. As he spoke, Tianqing Jiandi took out his spiritual sword. His spiritual sword was a golden immortal artifact. As soon as it was unsheathed, a dazzling sword intent burst out from Tianqing Jiandi's body. His sword intent was faintly divine. As he spoke, the golden spirit devoured. The tip of the sword was unsheathed, and it immediately slashed towards the nearest dozens of Supreme Sword Chi. At the same time, Tianqing Jiandi's other hand also condensed immortal power and turned into an invisible giant hand. It enveloped the dozens of Supreme Sword Chi and was ready to collect it at any time. Tianqing Jiandi had 900 Supreme Sword Chi in his hand. Now, he was very familiar with how to collect the Supreme Sword Chi. The tip of the sword in his hand repeatedly weakened the power of the dozens of Supreme Sword Chi. At the same time, Ancestor Gui Wu also acted together to help Tianqing Jiandi weaken the power of the Supreme Sword Chi. It's starting. In the Primal Chaos Ruins, Chu Fengmian could clearly sense that his plan could begin when the Celestial Sacred Sword Emperor and the Martial Ghost Patriarch made their moves. Luring Tianqing Jiandi and Ancestor Gui Wu to the chaotic ruins was the first step of Chu Fengmian's plan. Now that the first step was successful, it was time to move on to the second step. First, weaken the strength of the two of them. Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered. Suddenly, with a thought, an invisible spiritual power was injected into all the Supreme Sword Qi, causing the power of the Supreme Sword Qi to suddenly skyrocket. On the other side, under the joint attack of the two immortal generals, Tianqing Jiandi and Ancestor Gui Wu, the dozens of Supreme Sword Qi had been forced into a desperate situation. It was simply impossible to resist. They were about to be enveloped by Tianqing Jiandi's invisible giant hand and taken into the palm of his hand. These Supreme Sword Qi seemed to be ownerless. It won't be difficult to collect them. Seeing this scene, Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's eyes were filled with excitement. When he saw so many Supreme Sword Qis, he had some suspicions in his heart. He suspected that there was a trap. However, when he attacked, he realized that these Supreme Sword Qis were only instinctive and obviously ownerless. In this way, it would be much easier for him to deal with them. Although there were more than 1,000 Supreme Sword Qi in the returning ruined sky, and once they were gathered together, their power would be incomparably powerful. However, he only needed to break them one by one. If dozens of Supreme Sword Qi were to join forces, they would not be able to do anything. We can't let our guard down. If the other Supreme Sword Qi were to join forces, it would be troublesome. Ancestor Gui Wu observed his own body and said, "In the chaotic ruins, we can't replenish our immortal power. Moreover, we have to constantly consume our immortal power to resist the poison of the chaotic spiritual Qi. We have to solve this quickly." Ancestor Gui Wu's face was very anxious. In the chaotic ruins, he had always felt that he was in danger, so he did not want to stay here any longer. "Alright, then let's solve this quickly." Tianqing Jiandi nodded and did not continue the stalemate. Suddenly, the aura on his body skyrocketed. An invisible force enveloped his body, and his strength skyrocketed several times. It was obvious that he had activated a secret technique to increase his strength. Among immortal generals, there were always secret techniques that they could use. Now that time was of the essence, Tianqing Jiandi did not want to waste any more time. He immediately activated the secret technique, and his attack became several times more violent. The remaining power of the dozens of Supreme Sword Qi was almost instantly disintegrated. He no longer had any strength to resist. Seeing this, Tianqing Jiandi's palm, which had been covering the sky, suddenly fell and grabbed at the dozens of Supreme Sword Qi. Surrender. Tianqing Jiandi's face showed a hint of greed. However, at this moment, a dazzling sword light suddenly burst out from the depths of the chaotic ruins. Along with the appearance of the sword light was an incomparably huge sword Qi. This sword Qi came from the depths of the chaotic ruins and slashed out. It contained a supreme sword will that could destroy everything. It suddenly burst out from the depths of the chaotic ruins and headed straight for Tianqing Jiandi. Ancestor Gui Wu slashed out. Chapter 21-22. This is bad. All the Supreme Sword Qi in the entire chaotic ruins have combined to form a sword Qi. It's going to kill us both. The moment Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor saw this incomparably huge sword Qi slashing towards him, he immediately realized what this sword Qi was. A hint of fear appeared on his face as he suddenly retreated. The invisible giant hand that shrouded them also dissipated. The dozens of Supreme Sword Qi flew out and merged with the huge sword Qi. How can a single strand of sword Qi possess such power? Just how many strands of sword Qi are there? Martial Ghost Ancestor dodged the sword Qi with a fearful look on his face. If this huge sword Qi were to hit him, he would be seriously injured even if he didn't die. Although the Supreme Sword Qi was a Supreme Sword treasure, the power of these Supreme Sword Qi was enough to threaten an immortal general expert. This was far beyond his expectations. This is 1,800 Supreme Sword Qi. A total of 1,800 Supreme Sword Qi. God, How can there be so many Supreme Sword Chi here? On the other side, the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's gaze was fixed on the huge Sword Chi. The huge Sword Chi was actually 1,800 Supreme Sword Chis that had been condensed into a single ray of devouring. The Sword Chi was prepared to kill with one blow. However, the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor, the martial ghost ancestor, was extremely decisive. The moment he saw the enormous sword aura slashing toward him, he immediately chose to dodge. He did not take any risks, causing the enormous sword aura to miss. However, the moment the huge sword Chi approached martial ghost ancestor Tianqing Jiandi, it suddenly shattered and turned into the shape of spiritual swords. 1,800 Supreme Sword Chi dispersed and suddenly formed a sword formation. The sword formation enveloped the martial ghost ancestor and the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor. At a glance, it seemed as if every single strand of Supreme Sword aura in the sword formation was a separate existence. However, upon closer inspection, one would discover that every single strand of Supreme Sword aura was connected to one another. The entire grand formation was a single entity. Unless all the Supreme Sword Chi were broken, it was impossible to break this sword formation. This was the first sword formation, the Supreme Sword Formation. 1,800 Supreme Sword Chi was enough to condense the embryonic form of the Supreme Sword Formation and display a part of its power. Seeing the formation of the sword formation, Tianqing Jiandi and martial ghost ancestor did not have any time to react. The moment the two of them reacted, they were already trapped in this Supreme Sword Formation. Streaks of sword radiance surrounded the two of them, ready to stab at them at any time. Supreme Sword Formation. These Supreme Sword Chi actually know how to form a Supreme Sword Formation. The moment the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor saw the sword formation clearly, his face was filled with incomparable shock. He had never imagined that the Supreme Sword aura before him would actually know how to set up a sword formation. The Supreme Sword Formation was not the sword formation with the strongest attack, but it was the most difficult sword formation to deal with. Once trapped in the Supreme Sword Formation, it would be as difficult as ascending to the heavens to escape. Martial Ghost Ancestor looked at the Supreme Sword Chi with an ugly expression. He also found that the Supreme Sword Formation was flawless, and he had no chance to find a flaw to break it. Oh no, we'll be in trouble if we're trapped in the Primal Chaos Ruins. Once we run out of immoral force, we won't be able to resist the poisonous gas and miasma in the Primal Chaos Ruins, let alone the Supreme Sword Formation. Martial Ghost Ancestor said with an ugly expression. He knew very well that the Supreme Sword Array wasn't the biggest threat. The chaotic spiritual chi in the Primal Chaos Ruins, as well as the poisonous gas and miasma, was the biggest threat. He could break the Supreme Sword Formation bit by bit. Sooner or later, he would be able to break it, but his current immoral power could not last that long. In the chaotic ruins, not only did he have no way to replenish his immoral power, but he also had to constantly consume his immoral power to resist the chaotic spiritual chi. His immoral power could only last for half an hour at most. Although he could replenish his immoral power by devouring immortal stones, it was simply a drop in the bucket compared to his consumption. Don't hold back. Attack with all your might. This Supreme Sword Chi is after all an ownerless object. The power it contains will not last long. Let's blast it out. The Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor moved abruptly as all the energy in his body burst out at the same time. Countless secret techniques were unleashed at this moment. Surges of energy were added to his body as though an ancient Sword Emperor had descended. Sword after sword bombarded the Supreme Sword Formation. 10 great ghost generals. Old Ancestor Gui Wu clenched his teeth and took out his trump card. He took out a gourd. This gourd wasn't an ordinary green gourd, it was a unique gray gourd. He couldn't detect any signs of life on it. When the gourd was opened, more gray chi was emitted. This gray chi was death chi. Weaker martial artists and fey immortals would die on the spot if they came into contact with even a little of it. Even if they did not die, their lifespan would be affected. As the death chi appeared, 10 figures emerged from the gourd. These 10 figures were incomparably illusory. They were not humans, but ghosts. They were a kind of ghost clan. these 10 great ghost generals were martial ghost ancestors' trump card. Each of them had the strength of a peak immortal warrior. Once the 10 great ghost generals joined forces, they could even contend against an immortal warrior expert. The 10 great ghost generals were summoned, and together with martial ghost ancestor, they attacked the Supreme Sword formation. At this moment, Tianqing Jiandi and martial ghost ancestor both displayed their trump cards, bombarding the Supreme Sword Qi together. Even though the Supreme Sword Qi was supported by Chu Fengmian's power, it was still shaken by the bombardment, and the Supreme Sword Qi was sent flying. However, every time a Supreme Sword Qi was sent flying, the other Supreme Sword Qi would fly over and fill the gap. The strength of these two is really terrifying. They are much more powerful than Jihai Monarch. In the Chaos Ruins, Chu Fengmian could clearly feel the power of the Supreme Sword formation being bombarded time and time again. The strength of the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor had reached the pinnacle of the immortal general realm. Under the support of countless secret techniques, his strength was even more terrifying, far surpassing the Ocean Monarch that Chu Fengmian had fought before. As for martial ghost ancestor, although his strength was on par with Jihai Monarch, his 10 great ghost generals were not inferior to martial ghost ancestor. When they joined forces, they were almost equivalent to the strength of 2 immortal warriors. Chapter 21-23. Fortunately, I didn't act rashly and chose to use the Supreme Sword formation to test their strength. Otherwise, I would have been in danger if they had suddenly unleashed their full strength. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but think when he saw their strength. It was no wonder that Tianqing Jiandi and martial ghost patriarch were so confident that they dared to come to the 9 regions to hunt Chu Fengmian down. They weren't afraid of any traps. Given their strength, they could even escape unscathed from a profound Sky Immortal Marquis expert if they joined forces. With this kind of strength, the two of them could practically do as they pleased even in the 9 regions where experts were as numerous as the clouds. However, even though the two of them were strong, Chu Fengmian was fully prepared to deal with them. Although the two of them were strong, they were in the ruins of primal chaos. Here, the two of them couldn't unleash their full strength without restraint. Moreover, they had to constantly consume their strength to resist the chaotic spiritual energy in the chaotic ruins. Luring the two of them into the chaotic ruins was the real killer move in Chu Fengmian's plan. As for the Supreme Sword Array, Chu Fengmian did not need to use it to kill them. As long as he kept the two of them in the primal chaos ruins, the primal chaos spiritual energy in the primal chaos ruins would constantly deplete their strength. When the two of them were weakened to the lowest point, it would be time for Chu Fengmian to make his move. Chu Fengmian hid in the chaotic ruins and wasn't in a hurry to make his move. Instead, he was observing the two of them. Tianqing Jiandi and martial ghost patriarch were unleashing their full strength, frantically bombarding the Supreme Sword formation. The two of them unleashed their full strength and the crack that they had just created was getting bigger and bigger. This crack was a breakthrough point. The Supreme Sword formation was a whole entity. Now that there was such a crack, it was equivalent to the entire entity suddenly collapsing. The entire Supreme Sword formation was on the verge of collapsing because of this crack. It was on the verge of shattering at any moment. After all, these Supreme Sword Qis are ownerless and don't have much power left. Martial Ghost Patriarch, lend me a hand and I'll take all of them. Seeing that the Supreme Sword formation was about to be broken, Tianqing Jiandi's face was filled with excitement. He shouted loudly as he reached out to grab the Supreme Sword formation. Tianqing Jiandi wanted to take the entire Supreme Sword formation and all 1,800 strands of Supreme Sword Qi in one go. Originally, Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor only had 900 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. However, there were a total of 1,800 strands of Supreme Sword Qi in front of him. That was double the amount of Supreme Sword Qi in his body. If he could collect so many Supreme Sword Qi and comprehend the sword intent in them, his strength would reach an unbelievable level. Now that he had found an opportunity, the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor did not hesitate to take it. And this time, he had the help of Martial Ghost Patriarch from the side. The Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor channeled his spiritual energy and transformed it into a giant hand that grabbed at the Supreme Sword Array. Martial Ghost Ancestor also let out a long howl. The 10 ghost generals beside him suddenly spread out and stood apart. These 10 ghost generals were like 10 array cores. Suddenly, they formed a big formation. The core of this big formation was none other than Martial Ghost Patriarch. Martial Ghost Patriarch's power surged wildly. The power of the 10 ghost generals poured into his body, and he erupted with all his strength to bombard the Supreme Sword formation. Under the bombardment of countless immoral techniques, the Supreme Sword formation was already tottering and falling. Now that the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor had suddenly taken it away, the Supreme Sword formation was no longer able to resist and was about to be taken away. "These Supreme Sword Chis are all mine," Tianqing Jiandi shouted excitedly. His palm was already above the Supreme Sword formation. "Do it!" The moment Tianqing Jiandi was about to take the Supreme Sword formation, Chu Fengmian also knew that this was the time. Although there were as many as 1,800 Supreme Sword Chis, they were far from enough to fight against Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi, the 2 immoral generals. After delaying for so long, it was already enough. If Chu Fengmian didn't make a move and allowed the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor to take away the 1,800 strands of Supreme Sword Chi, Chu Fengmian would cry without tears. The moment he spoke, Chu Fengmian, who was in the depths of the ruins of chaos, suddenly swayed and appeared in front of Tianqing Jiandi. The 1,800 Supreme Sword Chis immediately burrowed into Chu Fengmian's body the moment he appeared, avoiding Tianqing Jiandi's palm. "Who are you? How dare you snatch the Supreme Sword Chis?" Tianqing Jiandi thought that someone had come to snatch the Supreme Sword Chis when he saw the figure that had suddenly appeared. Suddenly, the sword in his hand flickered and a sword light slashed at Chu Fengmian. However, just as the sword light was about to cut Chu Fengmian, the 1,800 Supreme Sword Chis suddenly flew out of Chu Fengmian's body and turned into a Supreme Sword formation in front of Chu Fengmian to block the sword light. After Chu Fengmian injected his spiritual power, the Supreme Sword Chis immediately recovered to their strongest state and turned into Supreme Sword Chis to protect Chu Fengmian. "How can you control these Supreme Sword Chis? No, are you the master of these Supreme Sword Chis? Did you lure us here on purpose?" The Heavenly Sacred Sword was stunned when he saw this scene. He had originally thought that these Supreme Sword Chis were ownerless and that Chu Fengmian had come to snatch them away. However, now that he saw that these Supreme Sword Chis were all under Chu Fengmian's control, Tianqing Jiandi suddenly realized that there was a trap. All of a sudden, he thought of a scheme. All of this was a scheme, a scheme. The Supreme Sword Chi was actually just bait to lure them here. Tianqing Jiandi was an immoral general who had experienced countless battles of life and death. Now, he suddenly realized that all of this was not a coincidence, but a scheme. So what if it's a scheme? You're just a little half-step celestial realm brat. How dare you scheme against me? If I kill you, these Supreme Sword Chis will still be mine. Die for me. After the Heavenly Sacred Sword Emperor saw through Chu Fengmian's realm, he immediately sneered and attacked. Suddenly, more Sword Chis appeared. They slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The power of this sword was incomparably sacred. Chapter 21-24. Tianqing Jiandi's name was Saint, and the sword technique he used was an extremely ancient holy sword technique. It was said that in ancient times, there was a huge sect called Holy Sword Sect, whose name shook the starry sky. The Holy Sword technique was inherited from Holy Sword Sect. Sword techniques were mainly used for killing. Almost any sword technique was filled with murderous intent, but the Holy Sword technique was different. It was a kind of sacred sword technique. Chu Fengmian didn't feel the slightest bit of danger when the sword slashed down. However, this was the biggest danger of the Holy Sword technique. It was impossible to guard against the sudden slash. However, Chu Fengmian had just seen Tianqing Jiandi fight with the Supreme Sword Array, so he had some understanding of Tianqing Jiandi's Holy Sword technique. Chu Fengmian's aptitude in swordsmanship even surpassed that of the Master of Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian could see some of the mysteries of any sword technique after observing it. Chu Fengmian was already prepared to deal with the holy sword technique. He directly pulled out his sword and slashed out with both swords. Two sword rays directly slashed at Tianqing Jiandi. Take the initiative to attack. The holy sword technique was impossible to guard against, so the best way to deal with it was to take the initiative to attack. Some martial artists, even those in the life and death realm or emperor realm, had a premonition of danger. This was an instinct, but this instinct couldn't detect the danger of the holy sword technique. Therefore, it was very likely that they would suddenly die under the holy sword technique. This was the most powerful part of the holy sword technique. But now, Chu Fengmian didn't choose to passively defend at all. Instead, he chose to take the initiative to attack and kill Tianqing Jiandi. Chu Fengmian's two sword rays contained the power of dragons and the power of stars. The two swords suddenly fell and swept down. The power of the 9 moves of the ancestor. The power of the 9 profound sword technique was released at the same time. In the face of an immortal general, ordinary sword techniques couldn't threaten them at all. Chu Fengmian's first move was an absolute killing move. Bang! The immortal artifact in Tianqing Jiandi's hand shook crazily when it collided with the two sword rays. The sword rays that Tianqing Jiandi just shot out were mercilessly shattered. Is this the strength of a half-step celestial being? Heavenly Saint Sword was stunned when he saw his sword chi shattered so mercilessly. He didn't expect Chu Fengmian to be so powerful. When he saw that Chu Fengmian was only a half-step celestial being, he relaxed a lot. But in this confrontation, it devoured everything. Chu Fengmian's strength wasn't any weaker than an immortal general. In fact, Chu Fengmian wasn't any weaker than him. Especially just now, in Tianqing Jiandi, in order to deal with the Supreme Sword formation, Ancestor Gui Wu had already consumed a lot of immortal power. Now, he had less than half of his immortal power left. As for Chu Fengmian, he was going all out. Chu Fengmian took the initiative to suppress Tianqing Jiandi with his swordsmanship. Withered Ghost Spear. Just as Chu Fengmian and the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor clashed, a long spear suddenly pierced towards Chu Fengmian's back. This long spear was a bone spear that was formed from countless bones and contained a dense deathly qi. Once it pierced into the body of a demon god, it was almost enough to kill him. Even if he didn't die, he would lose a lot of his lifespan. The appearance of the withered ghost spear was almost silent. The martial ghost patriarch, who was at the side, had sensed that Chu Fengmian and the Sky Sage Sword Emperor were the most serious in their fight. Thus, he suddenly made a move and launched a sneak attack on Chu Fengmian from behind. Just as the withered ghost spear was about to pierce Chu Fengmian's back, the Supreme Sword formation suddenly emerged from Chu Fengmian's back. The power of the Supreme Sword formation condensed into a shocking sword chi and collided with the withered ghost spear in the air. At the same time, Chu Fengmian's voice rang out. He turned his head and looked at Ancestor Gui Wu. His voice was full of sarcasm. Ancestor Gui Wu, do you think I didn't guard against you? You know who we are? Who the hell are you, kid? We have no enmity with you. Why do you want to deal with us? Ancestor Gui Wu said in surprise when he heard Chu Fengmian call out his name. He thought that Chu Fengmian had deliberately set up a trap to lure people into it and kill them to steal their treasures. This kind of double-cross was not uncommon in the 9 domains. It was even more common in a treasure land like the returning ruined sky. Many of the martial artists and demon gods who entered the returning ruined sky were lucky enough to obtain some treasures. However, less than 1 in 10 could leave Omega Sky alive. An ordinary man's wealth was his own ruin. Whoever obtained the treasures would have the possibility of being attacked by others. Ancestor Gui Wu wasn't surprised to encounter people who wanted to kill and steal their treasures. However, now that Chu Fengmian had called out his name, it meant that things were different. From the beginning, Chu Fengmian wanted to deal with the two of them. Who am I? Didn't you come to the 9 regions to kill me? Now you're asking me who I am? Chu Fengmian looked at Ancestor Gui Wu and sneered. You? You're the one who suppressed Juror? Ancestor Gui Wu's face suddenly became incomparably angry when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He came to the 9 regions to find Chu Fengmian. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian and rescue Prince Xia. He didn't expect Chu Fengmian to take the initiative to appear in front of them. Quickly release Zhu'er. Kid, let Zhu'er go. There's still room to resolve today's matter. Otherwise, what else can I do? Chu Fengmian shouted coldly, interrupting Ancestor Gui Wu's words. At the same time, Chu Fengmian waved his hand and a figure appeared in front of Chu Fengmian. That figure was none other than Sir Xia. When young Master Xia was released from the life seal, he immediately saw the martial ghost old ancestor. His face was filled with excitement as he spoke. Quick, father, kill this kid. Kill him. However, before Prince Xia could finish his words, Chu Fengmian's mind moved. A battle dragon claw suddenly condensed above Chu Fengmian's head and slammed down on Prince Xia. You're useless now. Die. Chu Fengmian's voice was incomparably cold. Chu Fengmian had spared Prince Xia's life because he wanted to use him to lure Ancestor Gui Wu and Tianqing Jiandi to the 9 regions and lure them into this trap. Since this goal had been achieved, there was no need for Prince Xia to live. Prince Xia actually wanted to deal with Chu Fengmian. Just this point alone was enough to make him suffer countless times. No! Ancestor Gui Wu burst out with all his strength. The power of the 10 great ghost generals condensed on his body and suddenly bombarded Chu Fengmian. He wanted to save Prince Xia, but it was already too late. Chapter 21-25. Chu Fengmian had long wanted to kill young Master Xia. However, he didn't kill him in order to deal with Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor and Martial Ghost Old Ancestor. Now that the plan had succeeded, there was no need for young Master Xia to continue living. The claw of the war dragon slammed down, and Prince Xia's body exploded in the air. He died on the spot. Damn it! Damn it! Witnessing Prince Xia's death with his own eyes, Martial Ghost Ancestor's face was filled with madness as he looked at Chu Fengmian. His killing intent was monstrous. Martial Ghost Ancestor roared again and again with boundless anger. Prince Xia was his only son. In order to cultivate Prince Xia, he had spent a lot of effort, but today, his son was killed by Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian even killed Prince Xia in front of him. This kind of hatred for his son's death was absolutely irreconcilable. Brat, how dare you kill Zhu'er? I'm going to kill you today. I'll make you accompany him in death. Suddenly, a white bone spear condensed in Martial Ghost Ancestor's hand. He poured immortal energy into it and immediately activated it, blasting it towards Chu Fengmian. Death Qi swept through the sky along with the white bone spear, shrouding Chu Fengmian's body. It erupted with the most powerful killing move, wanting to kill Chu Fengmian in one blow. However, Chu Fengmian moved his palm effortlessly. A stream of dragon power shrouded in front of him and turned into the claw of the war dragon. Once again, it bombarded the white bone spear and shattered it into pieces. Die! 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 At this moment, old Ancestor Gui Wu went all out. He had gone completely crazy. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian at all costs. Endless death qi burst out from his body. The deathly aura affected Martial Ghost Ancestor's body. If this death qi was used to fight the enemy, it was indeed very powerful. If the injuries were caused by immortal energy or spiritual energy, they could be healed with sage pills. However, the death qi would reduce one's lifespan. The lifespan of a demon god warrior was limited. Once it was reduced, it would be extremely difficult to recover it. However, it was extremely difficult to control the death qi. Only the Ghost Clan had the ability to control the death qi. As for the Martial Ghost Old Ancestor, it was obvious that he had cultivated a technique similar to the Ghost Clan that allowed him to control the death qi. However, normally, when Martial Ghost Old Ancestor wanted to use this death qi against his enemies, he would have to be very careful. He did not dare to take risks. But now, after seeing Prince Xia killed by Chu Fengmian right in front of him, Martial Ghost Patriarch had already fallen into a frenzy. He urged his deathly aura to erupt with all his strength in an attempt to kill Chu Fengmian. The death chi was gradually going out of his control. Chu Fengmian could see that Ancestor Gui Wu's face had aged a little. Clearly, he was also affected by the death chi. This kind of attack was simply going all out. Countless killing moves bombarded Chu Fengmian like a storm. Each attack contained killing intent. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of killing moves enveloped Chu Fengmian's surroundings, leaving him with nowhere to run. On the other side, Tianqing Jiandi also condensed his immortal power and erupted with a shocking sword light. He injected it into his immortal spiritual sword and slashed it towards Chu Fengmian. The power of this sword had almost surpassed the attack of an immortal general. In the chaotic ruins, Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi would only be in more danger if they continued to delay with Chu Fengmian. Previously, in order to deal with the Supreme Sword formation, the two of them had exhausted too much of their strength. Now, they had less than half of their immortal power left. They could not afford to delay their fight with Chu Fengmian. Therefore, their first move was an absolute killing move. Chu Fengmian's eyes were incomparably serious as the two immortal generals joined forces. After all, he was facing two immortal generals. Even with Chu Fengmian's current strength, if he was not careful, he might fall into an irrecoverable situation and die on the spot. However, Chu Fengmian had already made thorough preparations to deal with the two of them. Although the two of them were going all out, Chu Fengmian also had a way to deal with them. Jianwang change. Whoosh! In an instant, Chu Fengmian's figure disappeared from the chaotic ruins and suddenly entered the depths of the void. While waiting for the two of them in the chaotic ruins, Chu Fengmian had also opened up many spatial passages in advance. These spatial passages were connected to the depths of the void. They were originally a backup plan that Chu Fengmian had left behind in order to escape unscathed. Now, these spatial passages could help Chu Fengmian avoid the sharp edge. Chu Fengmian could also see that the two of them were now attacking with all their might. It was not wise for Chu Fengmian to fight them head-on at this time. It was better to avoid the sharp edge. Chu Fengmian's figure disappeared from the chaotic ruins. Tianqing Jiandi and Martial Ghost Patriarch's desperate attacks hit empty air. For a moment, the two of them looked at each other. There was still some madness in Martial Ghost Patriarch's eyes. He was ready to continue chasing Chu Fengmian, but Tianqing Jiandi spoke calmly. This person has already prepared a backup plan. This time, the two of us can't kill him. Let's go. This time, we're doomed. Once we recover our full strength, it will be easy to kill this person again. This time, the two of them had been tricked by Chu Fengmian. When they attacked, their immortal power had already been reduced to less than half. Under such circumstances, they had almost forced Chu Fengmian into a desperate situation. When the two of them fully recovered their strength, Chu Fengmian would undoubtedly die if they came to kill him again. Moreover, this time, Chu Fengmian had also used up all his trump cards. The two of them would no longer be passive when dealing with Chu Fengmian next time. Let's go! After listening to Tianqing Jiandi's advice, Martial Ghost Patriarch gradually calmed down. After all, he was an immortal general who had experienced countless battles of life and death. Young Master Xia's death just now had indeed deeply provoked him. However, after hearing Tianqing Jiandi's reminder, he quickly came to his senses. In an instant, the two of them turned into two streaks of light and flew out of the chaotic ruins. Want to leave? Since the two of you have entered the chaotic ruins, don't think of leaving. Stay here forever. Chu Fengmian's voice suddenly rang out. Chu Fengmian didn't appear, but a huge seal platform suddenly appeared out of thin air. This seal platform was the Life Grand Seal. The stamp platform was so huge that it shrouded the entire sky above the primal chaos ruins. Of course, Chu Fengmian's real target wasn't the chaotic ruins, but Martial Ghost Patriarch and Tianqing Jiandi. Chapter 21-26. The Martial Ghost Old Ancestor and the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor had expended a lot of immortal energy to deal with the Supreme Sword formation. Then, they had fought Chu Fengmian to the death and used up even more immortal energy. Now, the two of them were like oil lamps that had run out of fuel. What was even more fatal was that they couldn't absorb spiritual energy to recover their strength in the ruins of chaos. They could only devour immortal stones to recover their immortal force. But that was just a drop in the bucket. The chaos spiritual chi in the primal chaos ruins was depleting their strength at every moment. They'd planned to leave the ruins of chaos directly, but how could Chu Fengmian let them do that? The most important part of Chu Fengmian's plan was to lure the two of them into the ruins of chaos so that he could use the power of the ruins of chaos to kill them. That was why Chu Fengmian had chosen to set up the trap in the ruins of chaos. In the ruins of chaos, he could use his divine veins to recover his strength at all times. From this point of view, Chu Fengmian had the upper hand. The life seal shrouded the sky above the ruins of chaos, turning the place into a huge prison. Forefather Marshal Gui and Tianqing Jiandi were the prisoners. Damn it! That's an immortal weapon. This kid has an immortal weapon? Tianqing Jiandi's face turned ugly as he looked at the sealed ruins of chaos. Chu Fengmian's plan was layered on top of one another, and the two of them had rashly walked into an extremely dangerous trap. He was well aware that every moment in the ruins of chaos was incomparably dangerous. Even if Chu Fengmian didn't do anything, if the two of them couldn't break the life seal and leave the ruins of primal chaos, it wouldn't take long for them to die in the miasma and poison in the ruins of primal chaos. So what if it's an immortal weapon? This kid hasn't stepped into the celestial realm yet. Even if he has an immortal weapon, he won't be able to exert its full power. Let's work together and break a hole in the seal. Old Ancestor Gui Wu raised both of his palms into the air and gathered his power in his palms. Suddenly, he sent out a palm strike that bombarded the great life seal. Rumble! The power of the two palms slammed onto the life's great seal. The power was strong enough to shatter a heavenly-grade spiritual artifact. An ordinary immortal artifact would be blasted away. However, this common people's great seal was no ordinary immortal artifact. It was the seal platform of the once invincible expert, the common people's great emperor. It was imbued with the common people's great emperor's great seal. Among the countless immortal artifacts, this common people's great seal was of an extremely high grade. Martial Ghost Old Ancestor gathered his power and struck out with both palms, but he couldn't shake the life seal at all. Seeing this, Tianqing Jiandi also drew its spiritual sword and slashed out. This slash was made with pure strength, and it hit the life seal. However, the result of this sword strike was the same as before. When it struck the great life seal, it was unable to shake it at all. It couldn't even make a dent in it. You want to break it? How laughable. If the two of you were at full strength, you might still have a chance to break this seal. Unfortunately, the two of you are already at the end of your rope and don't have much strength left. Chu Fengmian's figure appeared in the chaotic ruins, laughing as he spoke. This common people's great seal was Chu Fengmian's final trump card. Chu Fengmian had fought with the sacrificial ocean monarch and blood moon monarch before, so he knew very well how powerful these immortal generals were. Moreover, each of these immortal generals had their own recordings and trump cards. Although Chu Fengmian had set up a trap at the beginning, using the Supreme Sword formation to weaken the strength of Martial Ghost Old Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi, Chu Fengmian still wouldn't be able to deal with them. However, if Chu Fengmian acted rashly, it was very likely that the two of them would seize the opportunity to launch a counterattack. At that time, Chu Fengmian wouldn't be able to withstand their sudden attack. Therefore, Chu Fengmian didn't want to fight them head-on from the beginning. Instead, he used the chaotic spiritual chi in the chaotic ruins to wear them down. He forced the two of them to the end of their rope. At this time, Chu Fengmian used the common people's great seal, and the two of them had no chance to escape. Now, Martial Ghost Old Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi were like turtles in a jar. They had nowhere to run. I'll give you two a chance. Submit to me and I'll let you live. This is your only chance. Chu Fengmian looked at Martial Ghost Old Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi and said. The two of them were immortal generals. An immortal general was absolutely invincible in the 9 domains. Devour. Even Chu Fengmian would find it extremely difficult to deal with either of them if he didn't set up a trap. With Chu Fengmian's full strength, defeating one of them wouldn't be a problem. However, it was impossible to kill the other. Now that the two of them had been forced into a desperate situation by Chu Fengmian, it was also Chu Fengmian's long-term plan. Since Prince Xia, Chu Fengmian had laid out a plan. In addition, the two of them had entered the chaotic ruins without fear. That was why Chu Fengmian's plan had succeeded. If the two of them had been careful and probed first, it wouldn't have been so easy for Chu Fengmian to succeed. However, the winner was king. Now, the two of them had been forced into a desperate situation. Their life and death were under Chu Fengmian's control. Submit or die. Chu Fengmian's eyes were incomparably cold as he glanced at the two of them. Submit? Boy, you're insulting an immortal general. You killed my son and you still want me to submit? You're dreaming. Even if I die today. Even if I die today. I'll drag you down with me. Martial Ghost Old Ancestor roared again and again. He directly burned his blood and went all out. He would rather die than to kill Chu Fengmian. 1,000 ghosts devour the heart. Countless death chi erupted from Martial Ghost Old Ancestor's body. His body began to decay and turned into a skeleton. His whole person had turned into a state that was neither human nor ghost. This move, 1,000 ghosts devour the heart, was also his most powerful move, his most powerful killing move, to feed the ghosts with his body. It was a true desperate move in exchange for power. Once this move was used, Martial Ghost Old Ancestor would undoubtedly die. His only goal now was to kill Chu Fengmian. Desperate? Chu Fengmian's eyes were incomparably serious. He also knew how terrifying it would be if an immortal general really gave up his life and went all out. His body retreated again and again. At the same time, the power of the life seal condensed in front of Chu Fengmian, forming a barrier to protect Chu Fengmian's body. But at this moment, Martial Ghost Old Ancestor's figure suddenly changed direction. He no longer rushed towards Chu Fengmian, but towards the sky. Chapter 21-27. The Martial Ghost Old Ancestor's target was the life seal. He gave up his life and erupted with all his strength. Seeing that Chu Fengmian was already prepared, he suddenly changed his target. Sky Sage. Run away. You must find out the identity of this brat and kill him. Torture all the people around him, all his family, all his friends, all of them to death. The Martial Ghost Ancestor used all of his strength to attack the Life Grand Seal. This was a life-risking strike. His strength surpassed his peak, and when it hit the Life Grand Seal trembled continuously, and a gap was forcibly opened. This attack was also the full force of the Martial Ghost Old Ancestor's life-risking attack. The moment a hole appeared in the life seal, the Martial Ghost Old Ancestor died on the spot. Seeing that a hole had appeared in the life seal, Tianqing Jiandi did not hesitate. He instantly activated his escape light and escaped through the hole. Even though Chu Fengmian tried his best to activate the life seal to seal the space, he still let Tianqing Jiandi escape. Not good. We can't let Tianqing Jiandi escape. If he escapes, we'll be in trouble. Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with anxiety. He did not expect that the Martial Ghost Old Ancestor would give up his life to let Tianqing Jiandi escape. This time, the enmity between Chu Fengmian and Tianqing Jiandi could be said to be irreconcilable. Even though the two of them had no enmity with each other, because Chu Fengmian and Tianqing Jiandi both had Supreme Sword Qi, the two were already mortal enemies. If the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor were to escape this time, then the future would be incomparably troublesome. The Martial Gui Old Ancestor's threat was not exaggerated at all. With the current enmity in the world, if the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor were to escape, then the Martial Gui Old Ancestor would definitely be killed. The people around Chu Fengmian would be in incomparable danger. Chu Fengmian's identity was not difficult to find out in the 9 domains. When the time comes, if an immortal general expert targeted the Sword Dao sect, it would be a disaster for the Sword Dao sect. After all, Chu Fengmian could not guard the Sword Dao sect all the time. Today, Japan must kill Tianqing Jiandi to prevent any future troubles. Tianlong transformation. Chu Fengmian put away the life seal and activated the power of ancestor Tianlong. Instantly, he transformed into a 30,000-meter tall ancestor Tianlong and chased after Tianqing Jiandi. After escaping from the ruins of chaos, Tianqing Jiandi entered the depths of the void while recovering his strength. In the depths of the 9 regions, there were layers upon layers of folded space, making it seem like there was no end to them. Trying to find Zhang Xian within them was no different from trying to find a needle in a haystack. Who would have thought that this time, I almost capsized in a ditch and died in a small half-step devour. In the hands of a celestial realm brat. However, this person's strength is obviously far inferior to mine. Once I recover my strength, I'll find this brat and kill him. Those 1,800 strands of Supreme Sword Chi will be mine sooner or later. Tianqing Jiandi muttered to himself as he shuttled through the void. He could not forget about those 1,800 strands of Supreme Sword Chi. This brat is a little strange. He's not easy to deal with. Let's go back to the 100 Regions Alliance first and find some helpers to deal with this brat. Tianqing Jiandi's eyes flickered as he shuttled through the void. He was planning to get rid of Chu Fengmian and return to the 100 Regions Alliance directly. You want to go back? Unfortunately, you won't be able to return alive this time. You'll die in the 9 regions. Just as Tianqing Jiandi was flying through the void, Chu Fengmian's voice suddenly rang out. At the same time, an incomparably huge figure chased after him from the depths of the void. It was Chu Fengmian, who had transformed into ancestor Tianlong. Chu Fengmian's escape light was even faster than Tianqing Jiandi's. In a few breaths' time, Chu Fengmian's figure had already caught up with him. Ancestor Tianlong? Tianqing Jiandi turned around and was stunned when he saw the 3,000 feet tall figure. He also recognized that it was the appearance of ancestor Tianlong, an innate divine beast. Who the hell are you? The one who's going to kill you. Chu Fengmian was too lazy to talk nonsense with Tianqing Jiandi. The moment he caught up with Tianqing Jiandi, Chu Fengmian immediately transformed into his human form. At the same time, he brandished his 2 spiritual swords. The pure yang heavenly fire condensed on the blades of the 2 spiritual swords. 3 suns blazing sword. Endless flames in the swords slashed out together, turning the sky into a sea of fire. Tianqing Jiandi was an immortal general expert. Even if Tianqing Jiandi was now forced into a desperate situation by Chu Fengmian still did not dare to relax. If he did not kill Tianqing Jiandi today, there would be countless troubles in the future. Therefore, Chu Fengmian did not give Tianqing Jiandi a chance to stall for time. He directly killed him. Damn it! Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's face darkened when he saw Chu Fengmian's attack. He did have the intention of stalling for time. When he was escaping, he had used the Jade Talisman to send a message, summoning several experts of the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance to protect him. As long as he could stall for time, the experts from the Alliance of 100 Extremes would arrive. No matter how strong Chu Fengmian was, he could only leave with his tail between his legs. But now, Chu Fengmian did not give him a chance to stall for time at all. His sword was an absolute killing move. Pilgrimage of 10,000 Swords. Tianqing Jiandi roared angrily. 900 Supreme Sword Chi flew out from beside him at the same time to protect his body. At the same time, countless sacred lights fell from the sky to his body as a final defense. Beams of holy light clashed with the 3 suns blazing sword in the air. Don't waste your energy. Your current strength is less than 1/10 of what it is. You want to fight me? You're dreaming. Chu Fengmian sneered. Tianqing Jiandi was already at the end of his rope. His current strength was even less than 1/10 of what it was. No matter how strong Tianqing Jiandi was, he was still dreaming if he wanted to fight Chu Fengmian with his current strength. As he spoke, Chu Fengmian unsheathed his sword again. This time, countless sword lights flashed and merged into the sword, turning into a hurricane and slashing down. Sword of Four Directions Hurricane. The power of this sword was even stronger than before. Bam! Rumble! The whole void was swept by countless sword chi hurricanes. There was nowhere to hide. Ah! The Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor let out a miserable shriek as his body was engulfed by a sword chi hurricane. Countless sword chi slashed his body, leaving countless wounds on his skin. Immortal generals had already cultivated the immortal bones. Their bodies were dozens of times tougher than those of immortal realm experts. If an immortal realm martial artist or demon god were to be sucked into the sword chi hurricane formed by the four-wind sword, they would be mercilessly smashed into pieces in an instant. However, the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor had withstood it with his physical body. Chapter 21-28. However, Tianqing Jiandi was already seriously injured and barely able to hold on. His strength had already been depleted to begin with. Now that he was injured again, his strength had decreased by more than half. Tianqing Jiandi was now covered in blood. He looked extremely miserable and had lost all of his previous awe-inspiring appearance. Let's collect the Supreme Sword Chi first. Chu Fengmian also knew that Tianqing Jiandi did not have much ability to resist. However, he was still extremely cautious. He had to collect the Supreme Sword Chi first. These 900 Supreme Sword Chi were now integrated into Tianqing Jiandi's body. Tianqing Jiandi relied on these 900 Supreme Sword Chi to barely hold on. If he took away these Supreme Sword Chi, Tianqing Jiandi would not have any ability to resist. The Ancient Emperor's Art of War. Chu Fengmian's spiritual power condensed in the palm of his hand as he displayed the Ancient Emperor's Art of War. An invisible hand enveloped Tianqing Jiandi's body and suddenly grabbed it. Boom! Within Tianqing Jiandi's body, the 900 Supreme Sword Chi were constantly trembling. Waves of sword intent were emitted from Tianqing Jiandi's body. These 900 Supreme Sword Chi were about to be extracted from Tianqing Jiandi's body bit by the Ancient Emperor's Art of War. Tianqing Jiandi roared crazily. It used all of its means to resist, but it was useless. As a shocking sword light burst out, rays of sword light suddenly flew out of Tianqing Jiandi's body. They were the 900 Supreme Sword Chi. Whoosh! The moment these 900 Supreme Sword Chi flew out of Tianqing Jiandi's body, they directly escaped into the depths of the void, preparing to escape. The Supreme Sword Chi had a consciousness and was unwilling to be subdued. As soon as it left Tianqing Jiandi's body, it wanted to escape. However, Chu Fengmian was prepared. He had subdued many Supreme Sword Chis before, so he naturally knew this. The 900 Supreme Sword Chi had just escaped into the void when Chu Fengmian suddenly waved his hand. His palm traversed thousands of miles and caught the 900 Supreme Sword Chi in his palm. Suppress him. The boundless dragon's might came crashing down. The power of the 900 Supreme Sword Chis was being wiped out bit by bit, and they no longer had the ability to resist. Withdraw. Chu Fengmian roared and a shocking sword light erupted from his back, enveloping the 900 Supreme Sword Chi above. The Supreme Sword Chi was completely refined by the shocking sword light. 900 pieces of Supreme Sword Chi fell into Chu Fengmian's hand. After being refined, Chu Fengmian clearly felt that the 900 Supreme Sword Chis were already under his control. 2,700 Supreme Sword Chi. Chu Fengmian was extremely excited when he saw this number. There was a total of 3,000 Supreme Sword Chis. Now, Chu Fengmian had a total of 2,700 Supreme Sword Chis in his hand. He was only 300 away from the 3,000 Supreme Sword Chis. After obtaining 300 Supreme Sword Chis, Chu Fengmian would be able to exert the true power of this Supreme Sword treasure. After obtaining the 900 Supreme Sword Chis, the combined power of the 2,700 Supreme Sword Chis was several times more powerful than the 1,800 Sword Chis before. Chu Fengmian could sense that the power of the sword formation formed by these 2,700 Supreme Sword Chis was enough to kill an immortal general expert. This time, Chu Fengmian had obtained 90% of the supreme sword qis. The remaining 300 sword qis would not be able to do anything. Since Chu Fengmian had controlled 90% of the supreme sword qis, the remaining sword qis would be attracted to him. In the end, Chu Fengmian would be able to gather 3,000 supreme sword qis. This time, Chu Fengmian's plan was a great success. On the other side, Tianqing Jiandi, who had lost the supreme sword qis, did not even have the last bit of strength to resist. His whole body became incomparably old, without any strength to resist. The essence blood of an immortal general contains immortal power. It's just right for me to devour and increase my strength. Devour. Chu Fengmian looked at Tianqing Jiandi and did not talk nonsense with him. He immediately activated the heaven-devouring secret technique and pulled the Tianqing Jiandi into the heaven-devouring secret technique. In the black hole, Tianqing Jiandi's power was deprived little by little. The essence blood of an immortal general expert contained incredible power and immortal power. Every drop of essence blood was devoured by the heaven-devouring secret technique and turned into immortal power, pouring into Chu Fengmian's body. For a moment, Chu Fengmian's body was flooded with a large amount of immortal power. If it were an ordinary warrior of the half-step celestial realm or a demon god, such an enormous amount of immortal power could directly burst him to death. No matter how tough his body was, he could not bear such a huge force. But Chu Fengmian could bear it. His immortal real body had reached the third level, a level that countless celestial realm experts, and even profound heaven realm experts, could only look up to. Tianqing Jiandi and Ancestor Martial Ghost were both immortal generals, but none of them had condensed the immortal real body. It was enough to show that the immortal real body was extremely rare even among celestial realm experts. Chu Fengmian's immortal real body had reached the third level after countless opportunities. Now, the toughness of his body was more powerful than that of Tianqing Jiandi, who had condensed immortal bones. Therefore, Chu Fengmian could easily bear the force that others could not bear. A huge amount of immortal power poured into Chu Fengmian's body and was integrated into his blood little by little. If Chu Fengmian wanted to pass the heaven-defying tribulation, he needed to accumulate an astronomical amount of immortal power. If it was converted into immortal stones, it could be hundreds of thousands, or even millions. This amount of immortal power was far from enough to support Chu Fengmian's breakthrough. But devouring Tianqing Jiandi's essence and blood was no less than devouring the immortal power of 100,000 immortal stones. The essence and blood of immortal generals is really powerful. After devouring Tianqing Jiandi's essence and blood, Chu Fengmian sighed. No wonder immortal generals were so terrifying. The power contained in their blood alone had reached an unimaginable level. In terms of pure strength, Tianqing Jiandi was much more powerful than Chu Fengmian. If Chu Fengmian hadn't lured Tianqing Jiandi into the ruins of chaos and weakened his power with the help of the supreme sword formation in the ruins, it would have been impossible for Chu Fengmian to kill Tianqing Jiandi. But this time, Chu Fengmian not only killed Tianqing Jiandi, but also Ancestor Martial Ghost. He also obtained Tianqing Jiandi's supreme sword qi. It was a complete victory. First, he set a small goal, such as 1 second. Chapter 21-29. Tianqing Jiandi and Martial Ghost Patriarch had both died at Chu Fengmian's hands. Their empty rings had also been taken by Chu Fengmian. There were also countless treasures in their spatial rings. The two of them had come to the 9 regions for the countless treasures in the 9 regions. The two of them had explored the 9 regions and had obtained many treasures. However, all of these now belonged to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian only glanced at them briefly before putting them away. It's a pity that I didn't manage to devour Martial Ghost Patriarch's blood essence, Chu Fengmian said regretfully. The immortal power contained in Tianqing Jiandi's blood essence was equivalent to 100,000 immortal stones. This was an astronomical figure. One had to know that Chu Fengmian didn't even have that many immortal stones in his possession now. After devouring Tianqing Jiandi, Chu Fengmian's strength had increased by a few notches. If he had been able to devour Martial Ghost Patriarch, his strength would have been even stronger. Although martial ghost patriarch's strength wasn't as strong as Tianqing Jiandi's, they weren't far apart. Therefore, Chu Fengmian would have benefited greatly by devouring his blood essence. Unfortunately, martial ghost patriarch had chosen to risk his life. He had burned all of his blood essence and erupted with his strongest power to blast open the life seal, allowing Tianqing Jiandi to escape. However, the benefits he had gained this time were already huge enough. Just the 900 strands of Supreme Sword Qi were already a great harvest. Now, he had already gained control of 2,700 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. 90% of them had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands. This was a fatal attraction to the other strands of Sword Qi. As long as they were close to Chu Fengmian, these strands of Sword Qi would automatically fly to Chu Fengmian's side and submit to him of their own accord. Supreme Sword Qi could attract each other. I wonder if there are any more Supreme Sword Qi in the returning ruined sky. The Supreme Sword Qi that Chu Fengmian had obtained in the beginning was obtained by chance in the returning ruined sky. Later, as Chu Fengmian's strength improved, he entered the returning ruined sky several times and found some Supreme Sword Qi. Although the countless treasures in the returning ruined sky had been divided up by the extraterritorial powerhouses, there might still be some Supreme Sword Qi that had yet to emerge. Quickly return to your positions. Chu Fengmian's body suddenly erupted with sword intent and infused it into the 2,700 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. A surge of tyrannical sword intent swept through the entire returning ruined sky. All of a sudden, streaks of sword light emerged from the secret chambers of the returning ruined sky and flew in Chu Fengmian's direction. In the blink of an eye, a dozen sword Qis flew to Chu Fengmian's side. Indeed, there is still the existence of Supreme Sword Qi in Sinkhole Sky. He Fengmian's Izes, Fengmian's SS, Skies SS, SSSS hands SS, easilies. Were easily subdued easily subs. A total of 115 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. Chu Fengmian counted and found that a total of 115 strands of Supreme Sword Qi had been attracted. These 115 strands of Supreme Sword Qi were easily subdued by Chu Fengmian. In addition to the 2,700 strands of Supreme Sword Qi in Chu Fengmian's hands, he now had a total of 2,815 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. He was only left with 185 strands of Supreme Sword Qi to reach 3,000. These 185 strands of Supreme Sword Qi should not be in the 9 regions. Otherwise, given the amount of Supreme Sword Qi in Chu Fengmian's hands, even if they were hidden in the 9 regions, they would have been drawn over. Although Supreme Sword Qi was said to be born in the 9 regions, a portion of it had been taken out of the 9 regions for various reasons. Chu Fengmian had once obtained 800 strands of Supreme Sword Qi from Yi Jianxiu of the 5 Mountain Sword sect in the ancient monster continent. The remaining 185 strands of Supreme Sword Qi should have also left the 9 regions. He did not know who had obtained them. Although it was still very difficult to gather 3,000 strands of Supreme Sword Qi in a short period of time, Chu Fengmian was already satisfied. He now had 2,815 strands of Supreme Sword Qi. The remaining 185 strands of Supreme Sword Qi would not be of much use. As long as Chu Fengmian approached them, he would be able to discover and subdue the remaining strands of Supreme Sword Qi. There are countless experts gathered in the Sinkhole Sky. Although this is the depths of the void, I have just used the Supreme Sword Qi to set up a large formation and call for other Supreme Sword Qi. It is very likely that others will sense it. Let's go! After absorbing all the Supreme Sword Qi into his body, Chu Fengmian's figure moved and suddenly left the Sinkhole Sky. The Sinkhole Sky was a place of conflict. Now that Patriarch Gui Wu had died at the hands of Chu Fengmian and Tianqing Jiandi, there was no need for Chu Fengmian to stay in the Sinkhole Sky. Strange. The sword intent came from here. Why did it disappear in the end? Not long after Chu Fengmian left, a figure suddenly opened a spatial tunnel and arrived in the void. Supreme Sword Qi. It's the aura of the Supreme Sword Qi. I was a step too slow and did not catch this person. The figure was a young man. His appearance was extremely ordinary, like a passerby. However, when everyone saw the young man, they felt that he was like an unsheathed sword that contained sharpness. In his hand, there were also rays of golden light. Each ray of golden light contained sword will. It was the supreme sword chi. It's a pity that the royal sword chi of the supreme sword chi has fallen into my hands. It will be easy to summon the other supreme sword chi. However, it seems that the other supreme sword chi have all been obtained by one person. This is troublesome, the young man muttered. The young man murmured to himself. One of the supreme sword chi in his hand was unusually dazzling. In terms of sharpness, it was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than the other supreme sword chis. However, since this person is in the 9 domains, I will be able to find him sooner or later. The young man stayed in the void and observed for a while before leaving. After a while, several figures arrived in the depths of the void. There were old and young figures, but their clothes were very similar. On their chests, there was a jade talisman with the words 100 Absolutes. They were experts from the 100 Absolutes Star Domain Alliance. Gui Wu and Heavenly Saint are both dead. Among this group of people, an old man observed the surroundings and frowned as he spoke. What's going on? Did the two of them leak the information about the remnant map? First, set a small target. For example, 1 second. Remember, Book Dweller. Chapter 2130. Impossible. We just got this news. Gui Wu and Tianxing don't even know the origin of this map fragment. How could they leak it? One of the women said after observing their surroundings. This is the sinkhole heaven. It's possible that the two of them were targeted by someone, and that someone wanted to kill them to steal their treasures. Killed to steal the treasure? You should know Gui Wu and Tianxing's strength. Unless it was a profound heaven realm expert, who could kill them? Another middle-aged man walked out from the group and snorted coldly. Why would a profound heaven realm expert kill Gui Wu and Tianxing for no reason? What if the two of them were blind enough to provoke some invincible expert? That's also possible. The lady sneered. The two of them aren't the only immortal generals that died in the 9 regions. There's no need to argue. Gui Wu and Tianxing are dead. The map fragment must have fallen into someone else's hands. This is a loss for our 100 Extremes Starfield Alliance. The old man who spoke first interrupted the argument between the two of them. This map fragment is related to the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. It's said that only the person who obtains the map fragment is qualified to compete for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. Our 100 Extremes Starfield Alliance originally had 2 copies. Unfortunately, one of them was lost by the two of them. The old man said with a cold look in his eyes. The 5th of December is the day the Upper Sword Sect's ruins will open. There's still half a month's time. You should use this half a month to find out who killed Gui Wu and Tianxing. We still have a chance to get the map fragment back. Remember, if you find out who killed Gui Wu and Tianxing, immediately send the news. Even if the person who killed Gui Wu and Tianxing isn't a profound heaven realm expert, he must be an extremely powerful existence. Don't fight with this person alone. Do you understand? The old man said with an unquestionable tone. The other experts from the 100 Territories Alliance also stopped arguing. After listening to the old man's words, they nodded their heads and left one after another. Chu Fengmian left the returning ruined sky. He didn't know anything about the commotion here. After leaving the returning ruined sky, he immediately returned to the Origin Sword World. The Sword Origin World was Chu Fengmian's home base. Now that Chu Fengmian had turned it into a holy land, its source energy was incomparably powerful and capable of protecting the Sword Origin World at all times. To Chu Fengmian, there was no safer place in the 9 realms than the Origin Sword World. This time, Chu Fengmian had killed the martial ghost ancestor and Tianxing Jiandi's 2 immortal generals. He had also obtained their spatial rings. His harvest was plentiful and he needed a safe place to take inventory. Furthermore, Chu Fengmian had obtained more than 1,000 strands of Supreme Sword Chi this time. Chu Fengmian needed to slowly comprehend the sword arts within them. He could not afford to be disturbed, so he returned to the sword origin world directly. When Chu Fengmian returned to the origin sword world, he did not make a big fuss about it. Instead, he went straight to the sword sovereign palace in the depths of the origin sword world. Other than Elder Yun, who had purified the demon emperor's heart and the absolute beginning sword's demonic intent, there was no one else here.
Oh?
Young master, you've gained something from your departure this time. Elder Yun, who had been purifying the demonic intent, came up to Chu Fengmian when he saw him return. He sized him up and said in surprise. He could see that Chu Fengmian's strength seemed to have increased after his departure for a few days. Although devouring the essence and blood of Tianqing Jiandi was far inferior to letting Chu Fengmian undergo the Deva tribulation directly, it was still enough to increase his strength. I did gain something. Chu Fengmian nodded and looked at Elder Yun. Elder Yun, I need to go into seclusion for a period of time. I'll have to trouble you to guard me. Unless something major happens, don't let anyone disturb me. Yes. Old Yun nodded. His figure left the Sword Emperor Palace and stood guard outside. On the other hand, Chu Fengmian opened up another space in the Sword Emperor Palace. He used the life seal to guard this space. After making sure that even immortal generals would not be able to enter this space, Chu Fengmian slowly summoned all of his sword qi. This time, in addition to the 900 supreme sword qi he obtained from Tianqing Jiandi, Chu Fengmian also collected 115 supreme sword qi hidden in the returning ruins heaven. Each of the supreme sword qi recorded the ancient swordsmanship of the supreme sword sect. Some of these swordsmanship were passed down from later generations. Countless sword sects in the world relied on the swordsmanship recorded in the supreme sword qi to establish and pass down their swordsmanship. However, some of the swordsmanship was obscure and difficult to understand, so they were all lost. Even Chu Fengmian was unfamiliar with many of the swordsmanship recorded in the supreme sword qi. These swordsmanship were suitable to be integrated into the Nine Realms swordsmanship to increase its power. Although Chu Fengmian knew countless swordsmanship, the foundation of all these swordsmanship was the Nine Realms swordsmanship. Whether it was the Nine Realms swordsmanship evolved from the Nine Profound Immortal Technique or the Nine Forms of the Primogenitor, their main body was the Nine Profound swordsmanship. Among the countless swordsmanship that Chu Fengmian knew, only the first swordsmanship had not been integrated into the Nine Realms swordsmanship. However, it was not that Chu Fengmian had not tried, but all of them ended in failure. The first swordsmanship created by the first Sword Emperor was one of the top 10 ancient immortal techniques. Even with Chu Fengmian's current understanding of sword principle, he could not fully comprehend it. Perhaps only when Chu Fengmian reached the origin of sword principle could he truly integrate the first swordsmanship into the Nine Realms swordsmanship. Supreme Sword Qi. Rise. Chu Fengmian sat on the ground. In front of him, countless streams of sword qi flew out. These streams of sword qi revolved around Chu Fengmian, bursting out with shocking sword intent. This sword intent contained the swordsmanship of the ancient upper sword sect recorded in the book. However, some weaker martialists were simply unable to comprehend the swordsmanship from the sword intent. Therefore, they only regarded the supreme sword qi as a kind of treasure similar to a spirit weapon. Only true sword principle powerhouses could understand that the ancient swordsmanship recorded in the supreme sword qi's sword intent was the most valuable thing in the supreme sword qi. Nine Realms. Various swordsmanship was comprehended from the sword intent and comprehended in Chu Fengmian's mind in an instant. The ancient sword principle book appeared in front of Chu Fengmian. A brand new page began to be written in it. More ancient swordsmanship was recorded in it. Chu Fengmian comprehended the ancient swordsmanship and recorded it in the ancient sword principle book. First, he set a small goal. For example, 1 second. Remember, book guest residence. Chapter 2131. The Supreme Sword Qi recorded the swordsmanship of the most ancient swordsmanship sect, the Shang Jianzong. The origin of the Supreme Sword Qi had always been controversial. Some said that it was a supreme sword treasure refined by the Shang Jianzong with the power of the entire sect at its peak. Therefore, the swordsmanship recorded in it was the Shang Jianzong swordsmanship. However, there were also other theories. It was said that the Shang Jianzong finally established the sect after obtaining the supreme sword qi and comprehending the swordsmanship in it. In all the records, the Shang Jianzong was the first swordsmanship sect. There were also various records about the origin of the swordsmanship. One of them was that the supreme sword qi was a supreme treasure condensed by heaven and earth. It recorded the swordsmanship and was obtained by the ancestor of the Shang Jianzong. He comprehended the swordsmanship in it and finally established the Shang Jianzong with the help of the swordsmanship and the supreme sword qi. Chu Fengmian was not clear about these two theories. The first theory was more widespread. But now, as Chu Fengmian obtained more and more supreme sword qi, he became more and more aware of the mystery of the supreme sword qi. This mystery did not seem to be something that could be created by humans. However, all of this was just Chu Fengmian's speculation. If he wanted to solve this mystery, he would have to obtain all 3,000 supreme sword qi. Only then would he have a chance to solve the mystery of the supreme sword qi. Time passed by little. In front of Chu Fengmian, the ancient swordsmanship book appeared. On the new pages, there were already swordsmanship recorded. Chu Fengmian had comprehended the swordsmanship in the 1115 supreme sword qi. He had comprehended the mystery of the swordsmanship and integrated it into the 9-region swordsmanship, becoming a part of it. Chu Fengmian's realm did not change at all. However, the integration of the swordsmanship made Chu Fengmian's aura increase dramatically. The sword intent behind Chu Fengmian even soared to the sky. If this was not the Sword Emperor Palace, perhaps the entire Sword Dao sect and the entire 9 regions would be able to see the shocking sword intent. This time, Chu Fengmian did not only comprehend the swordsmanship in the 1115 supreme sword qi, but also the swordsmanship of Tianxing Jiandi. Tianxing Jiandi practiced the sacred sword art, an extremely ancient swordsmanship. There were thousands of swordsmanship and unique swordsmanship everywhere. However, the sacred sword art could be regarded as the most unique among the countless unique swordsmanship. When Chu Fengmian fought with the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor, he had observed the battle between the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor and the Supreme Sword Formation and discovered some of its secrets. Otherwise, Chu Fengmian might have been tricked by the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor's sacred sword technique. Although the sacred sword art could only be regarded as an unorthodox swordsmanship, it still had its own uniqueness. Chu Fengmian's 9-region swordsmanship was a kind of swordsmanship created by integrating all the swordsmanship in the world. The integration of the sacred sword art into the ancient swordsmanship book was no less beneficial to Chu Fengmian than the integration of the supreme sword qi. He continued to comprehend the swordsmanship for a full 10 days. During these 10 days, Chu Fengmian stayed in the Sword Emperor Palace without moving. All his energy was focused on comprehending the swordsmanship. Many of the swordsmanship recorded in the 9-region swordsmanship had been comprehended by Chu Fengmian when he was still weak. Now that Chu Fengmian's strength was getting stronger, he comprehended some of the different mysteries of these swordsmanship again. Chu Fengmian carefully organized the swordsmanship in the book. Suddenly, a swordsmanship appeared in Chu Fengmian's mind. This swordsmanship inadvertently appeared in Chu Fengmian's mind. It was a kind of swordsmanship that was born by integrating the strengths of countless swordsmanship recorded in the ancient swordsmanship books. Chu Fengmian practiced this swordsmanship over and over again in his mind. After practicing it over and over again, Chu Fengmian finally opened his eyes. The ancestral dragon supreme sword appeared in Chu Fengmian's hand. Chu Fengmian held the spiritual sword and suddenly slashed out. The might of this sword seemed to be able to split the heavens and earth. The boundless violent power swept through everything. The entire Sword Emperor Palace was shaking. The surrounding space was already enveloped by the life seal, guarding this place firmly. However, it was about to shatter under the might of this sword. This was the result of Chu Fengmian trying his best to suppress the might of this sword. Otherwise, the life seal wouldn't be able to withstand the true power of this sword and would be blasted away. As for the Sword Emperor Palace, it wouldn't be able to withstand the sharpness of this sword. The might of this sword could be said to be able to split the heavens and earth. This is the first sword of the 9 regions swordsmanship. The initial sword shall be called Sky Splitter. Chu Fengmian looked at the sword in front of him and was very satisfied. He created the 9 regions swordsmanship and the ancient book of sword principle. He had integrated countless sword techniques into it, all for this day to create his own sword technique. Sky Splitter was the first sword of the 9 regions swordsmanship. In fact, for Chu Fengmian, with his current strength, creating a sword technique wasn't difficult at all. The Emperor realm, even the quasi-emperors, the life and death steps, all had the ability to create martial skills. However, what they created could at most be regarded as martial skills, not immortal skills. Chu Fengmian hadn't created his own sword technique because he was waiting for the moment when he was strong enough to complete the ancient book of sword principle. Today, as Chu Fengmian's sword principle improved further, he finally reached this step. Although he had only created the first sword technique, Chu Fengmian knew that the power of this Sky Splitter was definitely more powerful than the first 5 moves of the 9 profound immortal skill. It was even comparable to the 6th move. Even the first 2 moves of the first sword technique, the 3 Sun Blazing Flame Sword and the 4 Hurricane Sword, were not as powerful as this Sky Splitter. This sword technique was definitely an immortal skill. Even among the countless sword techniques of the immortal skill level, it was ranked as a top-grade sword technique. Boy, I thought you could only do this when you reached the celestial realm. I didn't expect you to create such a terrifying sword technique at the half-step celestial realm. The moment Chu Fengmian performed Sky Splitter, even Xing Xian was awakened. When he saw the complete sword technique, his eyes revealed a bit of shock. If the sword technique you created can be completed in the end, I'm afraid it's qualified to be ranked among the 10 supreme immortal skills of the ancient times. Xing Xian's words were incomparably shocking, but he also knew that there was no exaggeration in his words. He came from an incomparably ancient era and didn't know how many powerful immortal skills he had seen. He had seen the 10 supreme immortal skills of the ancient times. But now, the sword technique created by Chu Fengmian, Sky Splitter, still shocked him. Chapter 2132. Of course, the power of the 10 supreme ancient immortal techniques was not limited to this. However, the Sky Splitter that Chu Fengmian created was only the first move of the 9 realms sword art. Next, Chu Fengmian would create the second and third moves. If the 9 realms sword art could be completed, its future might not necessarily be inferior to the 10 supreme immortal arts of the ancient era. It's difficult. I can barely create the first move now. As for the second move, I have no clue. Chu Fengmian shook his head when he heard Xing Xian's words. This was the first move of the 9 regions sword principle. He had comprehended and created it after comprehending countless sword principles. Chu Fengmian had no clue about the next few moves. It's rare to be able to create such a powerful sword art in the half-step celestial realm. Xing Xian said after hearing Chu Fengmian's words. Even the first sword emperor created the first move of the first sword technique, the 3 Suns Blazing Sword technique, after he stepped into the celestial realm. Your first step is already ahead of the number 1 sword emperor, surpassing an immortal emperor. The number 1 sword emperor was one of the most heaven-defying sword cultivators since ancient times. He was known as the number 1. After becoming an immortal emperor, he created one of the 10 supreme heavenly sword arts. There was no need to doubt his monstrous talent. However, he had already stepped into the celestial realm when he created the first sword art. When Chu Fengmian created the move, he was only in the half-step celestial realm. It could be said that Chu Fengmian had surpassed the first sword emperor of his generation. Not enough, not enough. Chu Fengmian shook his head. Of course, he knew that it was extremely dazzling to be able to surpass the first sword emperor of his generation. However, Chu Fengmian knew very well that his master, the Lord of Sword Dao, was a supreme sovereign. His attainments in Sword Dao had even surpassed the number 1 sword emperor. He had become a supreme sovereign, the Lord of Sword Dao. However, even the Master of Sword Dao died under the siege of Tianjia regions. Chu Fengmian was far from surpassing the first Sword Emperor. In order to avenge the Master of Sword Dao, Chu Fengmian had to surpass the Master of Sword Dao. If you want to improve your swordsmanship, the best way is to go to the three great holy realms or Tianjia domain. Xing Xian was also aware of Chu Fengmian's past. Seeing Chu Fengmian's expression, he spoke. All sword arts, martial skills, and immortal arts originated from the four great sacred realms. If you want more sword arts, you will have to go to the four great sacred realms to have a chance. I know. Chu Fengmian nodded. He also knew that if he wanted to improve his strength further, it might not be useful for him to stay in the 9 domains. Sooner or later, Chu Fengmian would have to go to the 4 domains. Chu Fengmian still couldn't find any trace of the mysterious Tianjia regions. Even if he wanted to go, there was no way. However, Chu Fengmian had already learned a lot about the other 3 sacred realms. Chu Fengmian killed martial ghost ancestor in Tianqing Jiandi. Not only did he obtain their treasures, but he also obtained their memories. The 2 immortal generals were experts who had been famous for a long time. In their memories, they knew a lot about the 3 great holy realms. They even recorded the way to go to the 3 great holy realms. After Chu Fengmian finished his business in the 9 domains, he could set off for the 3 great holy realms. The 3 great holy realms were the real vast world with countless experts and countless treasures. It was the place where the real experts should go. Although the 9 domains had countless treasures and experts, it was far from being comparable to the 3 great holy realms. The mysterious Tianjia regions behind the 9 domains was the real existence that could be compared to the 3 great holy realms. Sword formation, rise. Chu Fengmian stood up. Suddenly, a burst of sword intent burst out. 2,815 Supreme Sword Chi suddenly flew out and surrounded Chu Fengmian, forming a Supreme Sword formation. The Supreme Sword Chi exerted its greatest power by combining together to form a Supreme Sword formation. The Supreme Sword formation was born from the Supreme Sword Chi. It could be said that it was tailor-made for the Supreme Sword Chi. It was known as the first killing formation. Other spiritual swords could also form a Supreme Sword formation. However, only the Supreme Sword Chi could exert the terrifying power of the Supreme Sword formation. Previously, when Chu Fengmian had 1,800 Supreme Sword Chi in his hand, it was already enough to form a Supreme Sword formation. This time, Chu Fengmian had more than 1,000 Supreme Sword Chi in his hand. He could form a more perfect Supreme Sword formation. As Chu Fengmian poured his power into it, all the Supreme Sword Chi returned to form a Supreme Sword formation in an instant. The Supreme Sword formation that was formed this time was countless times more powerful than the previous one. Chu Fengmian felt that if he was trapped in this Supreme Sword formation now, it would be difficult for him to escape. Chu Fengmian's strength definitely surpassed most of the immortal generals. Even Chu Fengmian admitted that it would be difficult for him to escape. For some of the weaker immortal generals, once they were trapped in this Supreme Sword formation, they might die on the spot. This was the tyrannical power of the Supreme Sword Chi. The sword formation formed was enough to kill immortal generals. Moreover, this Supreme Sword formation could only be considered as a half-finished product now. Chu Fengmian looked over and sized it up carefully. He could see that there was still a part of the formation I missing from this Supreme Sword formation. This part of the formation I was the missing 185 strands of Supreme Sword Chi. The Supreme Sword formation formed by 3,000 Supreme Sword Chi was the most complete. The one that Chu Fengmian had formed now was still incomplete. However, even if it was incomplete, its power was enough to kill immortal generals. It's a pity that I have a total of 2,815 Supreme Sword Chi, but I didn't get the King Sword Chi. I wonder where the King Sword Chi is. If I can get the King Sword Chi, the power of this Supreme Sword formation can be increased several times. Chu Fengmian looked at the Supreme Sword formation in front of him and muttered to himself. Supreme Sword Chi, a total of 3,000, this was something that everyone knew. However, what many people did not know was that within the Supreme Sword Chi, in addition to the 2,999 Sword Chi, there was also a King Sword Chi. This King Sword Chi was the core of the Supreme Sword Chi. It was also the true core of the Supreme Sword Formation. The Supreme Sword Formation that Chu Fengmian had formed now lacked this core. If Chu Fengmian could get the King Sword Chi, the power of this Supreme Sword Formation would be even more terrifying. First, set a small goal. For example, 1 second. Remember, book house. Chapter 2133. This Monarch Sword Chi is not in the 9 regions. I don't know where it went, but I now control 2,815 Supreme Sword Chi. I will encounter the other Supreme Sword Chi sooner or later. Supreme Sword Chi had the ability to attract each other. Chu Fengmian now had so many Supreme Sword Chi in his hands. The remaining Supreme Sword Chi would also be attracted to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was not in a hurry to find them. I have spent 10 days in seclusion this time. Chu Fengmian slowly stood up and withdrew his power. The 2,815 Supreme Sword Chi had all entered Chu Fengmian's body. He calculated the time and found that 10 days had passed. Since Elder Fan did not look for him in these 10 days, it proved that nothing major had happened in the Sword Dao sect. The people of the 100 Territories Alliance did not find out that it was Chu Fengmian who killed Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi. Chu Fengmian deliberately made a move in the returning ruined sky. First, he wanted to use the power of the chaotic ruins to weaken the two. Second, it was because the returning ruined sky was an incomparably unique region among the 9 regions. Inside, one would be blocked by an invisible force when trying to divine others, making it extremely difficult to do so. Therefore, even if the people of the 100 Territories Alliance knew that Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi had died, they might not be able to find out about Chu Fengmian. It's time to take a look at the empty rings of Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi. 2 empty rings suddenly appeared in Chu Fengmian's palm. They were the empty rings of Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi. Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi were both immortal generals and the higher-ups of the 100 Territories Alliance. Who knew how many treasures they had obtained in the 9 regions? Chu Fengmian had only taken a quick look before leaving the returning ruined sky in a hurry. Now that the cultivation was over, it was time to count the gains this time. Chu Fengmian's mind moved. A stream of spiritual power was injected into the empty ring from his fingertip. He opened the empty ring. Suddenly, a 7-colored light was emitted. At a glance, almost every treasure in the empty ring was a supreme treasure. Sage pills, sage medicines, immortal artifacts, and various wondrous items were all over the place. Any one of these items could make many experts in the celestial realm fight for it madly. However, this was normal. Old Ancestor Gui Wu and Tianqing Jiandi were both immortal generals. Ordinary treasures were not worthy of their attention. Only treasures that were useful to celestial realm warriors would be kept in their empty rings. Of course, among the countless treasures, Chu Fengmian was most concerned about the immortal stones. To him, the immortal stones were the most important things. Chu Fengmian needed a large amount of immortal energy to accumulate strength. He could only obtain it by devouring the immortal stones. A total of 17,000. Chu Fengmian quickly counted the number of immortal stones in the ring. The total number of immortal stones in Tianqing Jiandi's empty ring was 17,000. This number was neither too much nor too little. Now, Chu Fengmian had about 25,000 immortal stones left from the Dark Whale hidden treasure. In addition to the immortal stones from Long Wuxian and the South Dragon Emperor, Chu Fengmian had around 30,000 immortal stones in total. In addition to the 17,000 immortal stones, Chu Fengmian now had around 47,000 immortal stones. This was an unattainable number for any immortal general. An immortal stone was priceless in the hands of a celestial realm warrior. There were only a few immortal generals who could have more than 10,000 immortal stones, unless they had a shocking background. Now, the 47,000 immortal stones in Chu Fengmian's hands were absolutely a fortune. It's still too little. Chu Fengmian sighed and shook his head. With so many immortal stones, it was enough to support dozens of half-step celestial realm warriors and demon gods to break through the celestial tribulation. But for Chu Fengmian, it was far from enough. Previously, Chu Fengmian had devoured Tianqing Jiandi's blood essence, which was equivalent to the immortal power contained in 100,000 immortal stones. That was how Chu Fengmian's strength had improved further. If he wanted to accumulate enough strength to break through the celestial tribulation, he would have to devour 1,000,000 immortal stones in one go. 1,000,000 immortal stones was an astronomical number that was out of reach. The other way was to hunt other immortal generals and devour their blood essence, which was also extremely difficult. Immortal generals were people who had obtained countless opportunities and great fortune. They had their own trump cards and means. It was extremely difficult to kill an immortal general. Chu Fengmian was able to kill Martial Ghost Ancestor in Tianqing Jiandi because he had carefully planned a trap and lured them into it. As for the other immortal generals, this move might not work, because Chu Fengmian was able to kill Martial Ghost Old Ancestor and Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor. The most important thing was that he had found their weaknesses. It was Prince Xia and his boundless sword Qi. Chu Fengmian first captured Prince Xia and lured them into the returning ruins. Then, he used his boundless sword Qi to lure them into the ruins of chaos, where he trapped them and used the power of the ruins of chaos to weaken their strength. The right time, the right place, and the right people were indispensable. Although Chu Fengmian had the idea to hunt other immortal generals, he also knew that it was extremely difficult. If he wanted to break through to the celestial realm quickly, he would have to come across some amazing opportunities. Opportunities, by the way, what about that ancient map? Chu Fengmian suddenly recalled that he had obtained an ancient map from Prince Xia. It recorded a void coordinate, which was the entrance to the small world where Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi had taken place. That map was obviously a fragment, and there was another part of it. Chu Fengmian searched carefully. Sure enough, he found a similar ancient map in the Martial Ghost Patriarch's spatial ring. The moment the two ancient maps were taken out, they fused together to form a complete map. Chu Fengmian looked over and found that this map didn't only have one entrance. It even depicted a part of the situation inside the small world. Is there a sect inside? Chu Fengmian carefully looked at the image on the map. According to the description, this small world should be a sect. It could be said that it was a sect map, but the records in it were extremely vague, making it impossible to see the situation inside. It was extremely mysterious. It was no wonder that Martial Ghost Ancestor and Tianqing Jiandi didn't dare to rashly go after obtaining this ancient map. There was something strange about it everywhere. The Sword Execution Order map? How did you get this thing? While Chu Fengmian was observing, Xing Xian came over and suddenly recognized the origin of this ancient map. First set a small goal, such as 1 second. Remember, book guest residence. Chapter 2134. Upper Sword Enforcer Token? Chu Fengmian's expression changed slightly when he heard that name. He was no stranger to that name. It was a name that had been mentioned in countless ancient books. The Upper Sword Enforcer Token was the most valuable treasure of the Upper Sword sect. There were only 12 Upper Sword Enforcer tokens in the entire Upper Sword sect. Although it was called a most valuable treasure, it was actually a symbol of status. The Upper Sword Enforcer token did not have any power on its own. It was just that the materials used to refine it were unique. It was incomparably tough and indestructible. In reality, it was not even a spiritual artifact. However, the Upper Sword Enforcer token was worthy of being called a most valuable treasure because of one meaning. It was even more valuable than an immoral artifact. That was because the Upper Sword Enforcer token represented the identity of the Upper Sword sect's Holy Son. The Holy Son of the Upper Sword sect was equivalent to the core disciples of some sections. They had the qualifications to compete for the position of sect master. Unlike other sects, where disciples were promoted step by step, the holy son of the upper sword sect relied on the upper sword enforcer token. The person who obtained the upper sword enforcer token was the holy son of the upper sword sect. Even the upper sword sect recognized this identity. Even if it was a disciple of other sects, or even a demon, or even an ordinary person, as long as they held the upper sword enforcer token, they could become the holy son of the upper sword sect. They had the qualifications to compete for the position of sect master. The upper sword sect was a giant in that era. It was the strongest sect in the 9 regions. It was the first sword sect that created the sword Tao of the future. The status of the upper sword sect's sect master was extremely honorable. It was not just a sect master. It could even become the overlord of the 9 regions and control a large sect. More importantly, whoever obtained the position of the upper sword sect's sect master would be able to obtain the upper sword sect's most ancient inheritance. The upper sword sect's most ancient inheritance and most profound sword technique was Devour. Only the successive upper sword sect's sect masters had the qualifications to learn it. The strength of this sword technique made every upper sword sect's sect master an invincible expert of that era. No one could challenge him. Because of this, the competition for each upper sword enforcer token was incomparably intense. Many experts fought with their lives on the line for a single sword enforcer token. In that incomparably ancient era, the appearance of the upper sword execution order chart was enough to cause a storm of blood. The upper sword sect has been destroyed for tens of millions of years. The upper sword execution order chart disappeared along with the destruction of the upper sword sect. Why would it suddenly appear at this time? Chu Fengmian looked at the ancient map in his hand with surprise. Since this ancient map was the upper sword sect's execution map, then the coordinates and the entrance were the upper sword sect's entrance? Was this the location of the Shang sword sect? As the first sword principal sect recorded in the world, the ruins of the upper sword sect were something that countless sword cultivators would frantically search for. The most secret of unparalleled sword technique of the upper sword sect was something that countless sword cultivators yearned for even in their dreams. Many of Chu Fengmian's senior brothers and sisters had once sneaked into the void to search for the ruins of the Shang sword sect, but to no avail. Today, Japan's supreme sword sect is going to appear. The appearance of the upper sword execution order chart was definitely not a coincidence, especially since Chu Fengmian had obtained Tianqing Jiandi's memories. He also knew the origin of the upper sword execution order chart. The upper sword execution order chart was not found by Tianqing Jiandi in the ruins, but it suddenly flew from the void. It seemed to have chosen Tianqing Jiandi and fell into Tianqing Jiandi's hands. This was definitely not a coincidence. The upper sword sect was a colossus. It was said that there was more than one sect master who had stepped into the immortal emperor realm. If there was really some kind of scheme left behind, it was not impossible for it to have been left behind for tens of millions of years. But the upper sword sect has been destroyed. The upper sword sect that still exists now is nothing but ruins. Could it be that the upper sword execution order chart has appeared to compete for the position of sect master of the upper sword sect? But what's the use of the position of sect master? Chu Fengmian frowned. In that incomparably ancient era, the position of sect master of the upper sword sect represented hegemony and the authority to control the entire 9 regions. It was an invincible might. But now, the upper sword sect had been destroyed. Even if some things were left behind, they were only ruins. Even if someone became the sect master of the upper sword sect now, they would only get an empty shell. But the upper sword execution order chart suddenly flew out of the void and chose Tianqing Jiandi. This was definitely not a coincidence. This was because in Tianqing Jiandi's memories, he was not the only one who had obtained the upper sword execution order chart. There was another powerful sword cultivator, the heaven-breaking sword venerable, who also obtained the same upper sword execution order chart. Obviously, the upper sword execution order chart had taken the initiative to choose other sword cultivators. The sudden appearance of the upper sword execution order chart must have a purpose. Inheritance? Chu Fengmian frowned. Suddenly, he thought of something. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. The Upper Sword Sect had been destroyed in the ancient era. However, the ruins of the Upper Sword Sect, together with the inheritance, disappeared almost at the same time. The entire Upper Sword Sect seemed to have been erased by an era. Apart from the records in the ancient books and the Supreme Sword Chi, all other traces of the Upper Sword Sect had disappeared. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect had also disappeared. Logically speaking, even if a sect was destroyed, the inheritance in it would be very easy for it to survive. Just like the Yunyu Heavenly Palace, even if it was destroyed, the inheritance still remained, waiting for the successor. The Upper Sword Sect was a sect tens of thousands of times more powerful than the Yunyu Heavenly Palace. If the Yunyu Heavenly Palace could leave behind its inheritance, there was no reason why the Upper Sword Sect was not qualified to leave behind its inheritance. Coupled with the sudden appearance of the Upper Sword Execution Order chart, it was possible that the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect was about to be born. The sudden appearance of the Upper Sword Execution Order chart was to choose the successor. Therefore, the people who obtained the Upper Sword Execution Order chart were all sword cultivators. However, it seemed that Tianqing Jiandi did not realize that the ancient chart was the Upper Sword Execution Order chart. He just took it as a map of an ordinary small world. After all, the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor wasn't from the 9 domains. His understanding of the 9 domains was far less than Chu Fengmian's. Furthermore, even Chu Fengmian couldn't tell at first glance that this ancient diagram was the Upper Sword Execution diagram. It was only after Xing Xian's reminder that he realized all this. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect is about to be born. Something big is going to happen. Chu Fengmian said softly. There were no coincidences in the world. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect could disappear for millions of years. However, it suddenly appeared at this moment. It was definitely not a coincidence. There was something hidden in it. The upheaval of the 9 domains this time was probably not as simple as the 9 domains of heaven being about to be born. Chapter 2135. If this Upper Sword Enforcer token chart is related to the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect, then it will be a great opportunity for me. Chu Fengmian's eyes were very serious. He knew very well what the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect represented. The unparalleled sword technique of the Upper Sword Sect was the most ancient and mysterious sword technique. Regardless of whether Chu Fengmian comprehended it, integrated it into the 9 regions swordsmanship or mastered it, it would greatly enhance Chu Fengmian's strength. The sword cultivators selected by the Upper Sword Enforcer token chart this time are Tianqing Jiandi and Heaven-Breaking Sword Venerate. They are both immortal generals. I wonder if there are any mysterious Sky Realm experts among them. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. Heaven-Breaking Sword Venerate, another sword cultivator in the 100 Ultimate Star Region Alliance who had also obtained the Upper Sword Enforcer token chart, was also an immortal generals. He cultivated the Heaven-Breaking Sword technique, which was the sword technique of an extremely ancient sect called the Heaven-Breaking Tianjian sect. The Heaven-Breaking Sword technique was one of the most powerful immortal techniques. In terms of strength, Heaven-Breaking Sword Venerate wasn't any weaker than Tianqing Jiandi. He would also become one of the strongest opponents in the competition for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. However, there were a total of 12 Upper Sword Enforcer tokens in the Upper Sword Sect. Chu Fengmian only knew about the one in his possession and the one in Heaven-Breaking Sword Venerate's possession. Chu Fengmian had no idea whether the other 10 tokens had yet to be discovered or had fallen into the hands of others. If the Upper Sword Enforcer token chart was really related to the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect, then anyone else who obtained it would be Chu Fengmian's opponent and enemy. Let's talk about this after the Upper Sword Enforcer token chart recognizes me as its master. Chu Fengmian's mind stirred as a wave of sword intent condensed in his palm and enveloped the Upper Sword Enforcer token chart. The Upper Sword Execution Order illustration was actually a spiritual weapon. It could recognize a master, but the method was different from ordinary spiritual weapons. It was similar to the Supreme Sword Chi. Only the Supreme Sword intent could subdue it and make it recognize a master. As the sword intent enveloped the upper sword executor chart, ancient veined patterns appeared. Chu Fengmian could tell that these ancient veined patterns were unique to the upper sword sect. More and more veined patterns appeared. Eventually, they turned into a sword light and flew into Chu Fengmian's forehead. Countless memories immediately appeared in Chu Fengmian's mind. These memories were all related to the sword sect. In the memories, Chu Fengmian saw that the most important thing was a pregnancy. December 5, Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. The opening of the upper sword sect ruins was on the 5th of December. It was no wonder that Tianqing Jiandi and the martial ghost patriarch didn't enter the ruins. The two of them had obtained the upper sword executor chart but hadn't made it recognize a master. Naturally, they didn't know about this. Today was the first day of the 12th lunar month. In another 4 days, the Shang sword sect ruins would be opened. There are still 4 days left. I can make some preparations. Just as Chu Fengmian was observing the countless memories that had entered his mind, a shocking sword intent suddenly erupted from behind him. This shocking sword intent wasn't under Chu Fengmian's control at all. It soared into the sky. The entire Sword Sovereign Palace couldn't resist this sword intent as it soared into the sky. In the depths of the void, even the 9 domains and the endless starry sky seemed to be able to clearly sense this sword intent. Although this sword intent only existed for an instant, it dissipated immediately after. However, all the martial artists and Yao gods in the 9 domains and even those outside the 9 domains knew that the upper sword executor chart had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands. Not good. The upper sword executor chart has exposed my identity? Chu Fengmian's expression changed abruptly. The eruption of this sword intent had instantly exposed Chu Fengmian's identity. The fact that the upper sword executor chart had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands was also exposed. Is this the upper sword sect's test? Chu Fengmian's eyes were incomparably cold. The upper sword sect had released the upper sword executor chart to let the experts of the 9 domains compete with each other. In the upper sword sect's view, only the true peak experts were qualified to compete for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Therefore, once someone obtained the upper sword executor chart and made it recognize him as its master, their identity would be exposed and others would come to compete for it. It seems like I can't hide it any longer. However, I must obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Whoever dares to snatch it will only have a path of death. Murderous intent surged in Chu Fengmian's eyes. He was determined to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Whoever dared to compete for the upper sword executor chart would be Chu Fengmian's mortal enemy. Let's go! Since he couldn't hide it any longer, Chu Fengmian didn't stay in the Sword Sovereign Palace any longer. He immediately went to the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace. In the Origin Sword world, many disciples of the Sword Dao sect had seen the soaring sword intent just now. They could tell that the sword intent had come from the depths of the Origin Sword world. For a moment, there was a flurry of discussion. In the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace, Lord Slayer, He Luo, and the others were all chatting. At this moment, Chu Fengmian suddenly appeared and stepped into the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace. Sect Master. Greetings, Sect Master. Seeing Chu Fengmian's arrival, several disciples of the Sword Dao sect who were guarding the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace bowed and greeted him. Sect Master. Lord Slayer, Luo He, and the others all stood up and greeted him. Sect Master, what was that sword ray just now? Lord Slayer immediately asked when he saw Chu Fengmian sitting on the throne. The power of that sword ray doesn't seem to be the sword art of our Sword Dao sect. It came from the depths of the Origin Sword world. Could it be that an enemy has invaded? Lord Slayer was a sword cultivator. He could clearly sense that the sword ray just now wasn't the sword art of the Sword Dao sect. It was completely different from the sword intent on Chu Fengmian's body. Therefore, he immediately thought that an enemy had invaded. It's me, Chu Fengmian said with a serious face. Lord Slayer, give the order to summon all disciples of the Sword Dao sect from the 9 regions back to the Origin Sword world. I'm afraid that something will happen in the next few days. The Upper Sword Enforcer token diagram was related to the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. Now that the fact that Chu Fengmian possessed the Upper Sword Enforcer token diagram was exposed, there were many people who wanted to steal it from Chu Fengmian. Just now, Chu Fengmian felt that several spiritual senses were already probing Chu Fengmian. Obviously, there were already people who were tempted by the Upper Sword Execution Order portrait and wanted to snatch it. There were still 4 days before the Upper Sword sect's ruins opened. There would definitely be people who would make a move during this time. Chapter 2136. Now that Chu Fengmian's identity had been exposed, it would be even more dangerous for him to head to the 9 regions. It would be better for him to stay in the Origin Sword world, where he could borrow the origin power of the Origin Sword world to fend off external enemies. However, Chu Fengmian was worried that someone would attack the Sword Dao sect, so he immediately ordered the Sword Slayer King to summon all the disciples back to the Origin Sword world. Yes, Sect Master. The Sword Slayer King didn't hesitate at all when he heard Chu Fengmian's order. He immediately channeled his spiritual energy into the Jade Talisman and sent out countless Jade Talismans, ordering all the disciples to return to the Origin Sword world. Sect Master, what exactly happened? After doing all this, the Mad Dragon Emperor asked Chu Fengmian, "What's the matter?" His strength could be said to be the strongest in the Sword Dao sect, excluding Chu Fengmian. He was also aware of the terrifying power contained in the Sword Light just now. The power of the Sword Light could be clearly seen by the entire 9 regions. Seeing how serious Chu Fengmian was, it was definitely not a small matter. I obtained an Upper Sword Execution token. Chu Fengmian explained the origin of the Upper Sword Execution token chart and its uses. If this token is really related to the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect, it is indeed a treasure that will make people go crazy. I'm afraid many experts will come to snatch it. The Mad Dragon Emperor's face darkened when he heard Chu Fengmian's explanation. He had heard of the great name of the Shang Sword sect before. It was the first Sword Dao sect. In this era, countless sword techniques were passed down from the ancient Shang Sword sect. If the Upper Sword Execution token was really related to the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect, even profound Heaven Realm experts wouldn't be able to resist snatching it, let alone Sky Realm experts. No matter what, since the Upper Sword Execution token is in the sect master's hands, it naturally can't be taken away by others. Whoever dares to come to the Origin Sword world will die. Qing Meng said coldly from the side. The Upper Sword Execution token was so important that even Han Yueli, Luo Shi, Qing Meng, and the others who were in seclusion came out to discuss countermeasures. Just as they were discussing, a figure hurriedly walked in from outside. Sovereign. The person who walked in was none other than Luo He. He suddenly walked in from outside and spoke to Chu Fengmian with an incomparably nervous expression. The people of the Shenquan sect are outside the Sword Origin world. They said that they want to pay their respects to the sect master. You sure are fast. Chu Fengmian had just finished talking about the Sword Execution token chart when a sect came. Shenquan sect? Chu Fengmian frowned. This name was extremely unfamiliar to him. It didn't sound like a sect from the 9 regions. This Shenquan sect is said to be a sect established by cultivators from the Holy Spring Starfield. There are 3 celestial realm cultivators among them. Seeing Chu Fengmian's expression, the Sword Slayer monarch explained to Chu Fengmian. With the drastic changes in the 9 regions, cultivators from various starfields came to the 9 regions one after another. There were also many cultivators who brought their families and disciples to the 9 regions to establish their own sects, just like the 5 major sects in the past. The Shenquan sect was one of them. They occupied a piece of land in the southern region of the 9 regions and established their own sect. Among the countless newly established sects in the 9 regions, they weren't considered weak. The Holy Spring Starfield is said to be a second-grade starfield. The old ancestor of the Shenquan sect is an immortal general expert. He's extremely powerful. The Sword Slayer monarch said from the side. His tone was incomparably fearful. An immortal general expert was more terrifying than 10 immortal realm cultivators. The Sword Dao sect and the Shenquan sect had never had any interactions. This time, the Shenquan sect's sudden visit definitely didn't have good intentions. There was only one purpose, and that was to obtain the sword execution token chart. Sovereign, do we meet them or not? Luo he looked at Chu Fengmian and asked. In this hall, the only person who could make the decision was Chu Fengmian. It's best if we don't meet them. If the origin energy of the sword origin world is fully activated, even immortal generals won't be able to invade the sword origin world. The Mad Dragon Monarch said to Chu Fengmian. Sovereign, the Shenquan sect definitely doesn't have good intentions. Why don't we just meet them? Oh? Why not? Of course we have to meet them. They're guests from afar. If we don't even meet them, they'll say that our Sword Dao sect doesn't know etiquette. Moreover, he's just a small immortal general. Even if he comes, what can he do? Sitting on the throne, Chu Fengmian's tone was incomparably relaxed. Hearing this, the Mad Dragon Monarch was speechless for a moment. From Chu Fengmian's tone, it was as if he didn't even put an immortal general in his eyes. A half-step celestial realm cultivator said. How dare he look down on an immortal general expert? This was simply arrogance to the extreme. However, after interacting with Chu Fengmian for a while, the Mad Dragon Monarch knew that Chu Fengmian wasn't the kind of person who would be arrogant for no reason. Since Chu Fengmian was so confident, he didn't say anything to persuade him. Bring them in. Chu Fengmian looked at Luo He and said. Yes. Luo He nodded and left the hall. Not long after, the door to the Origin Sword world opened and a few figures walked in. There were old and young figures among these few figures. The person in the lead was a middle-aged man. He was dressed in a long robe and had the demeanor of a transcendent being. The tyrannical power of heaven and earth shrouded his body, revealing his strength. He was an immortal realm cultivator. As for the few young people behind him, although they were all young, they had already stepped into the half-step celestial realm. They were all first-class geniuses. After entering the Sword Origin world, the youths began to scan their surroundings. This Sword Origin world is said to be the sacred ground of a native sect of the 9 regions. I didn't expect it to be so powerful and have such rich and pure spiritual energy. One of the young people said in surprise. It's a pity that the disciples here are too weak. Most of them are far inferior to our Shenquan sect. Even the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu is rarely seen here. It's said that even a 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu can become an elder in the Sword Dao sect. So weak? The 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu is at most a core disciple in our Shenquan sect. He can barely be an outer elder. Even a few of my servants are 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu. These natives of the 9 regions have taken over such a good place. What a waste. If this sacred ground was given to our Shenquan sect could at least nurture countless geniuses. A Shenquan sect disciple's eyes revealed a hint of greed. Chapter 2137. Look, the soil on the ground is 5-colored growing soil. A young disciple of the Sacred Spring sect suddenly pointed at a mountain peak and said. The land on the mountain peak was filled with 5 colors, and it emitted a sweet fragrance. 5-colored growing soil. It's really 5-colored growing soil. The other disciples of the Shenquan sect also looked over and said in shock. They all knew that 5-colored growing soil was the best soil for growing sacred herbs. The sacred herbs that grew in it would grow 10 times or even 100 times faster than those that grew in ordinary soil. 5-colored growing soil could only be found in some treasured lands with extremely rich spiritual energy. Even a little 5-colored growing soil was priceless. At this moment, when they looked over, they could see that the ground on the mountain peaks was actually covered in 5 different colors. All of them were 5-color growing soil. They had never seen so much 5-colored growing soil before. It's a pity that such a sacred place is occupied by a bunch of trash. A disciple of the Shenquan sect looked at the disciples of the Sword Dao sect below and said with disdain, "Don't talk nonsense. We're here to negotiate with the Sword Dao sect. Don't let them get hold of our weakness." The middle-aged man who was the leader snorted coldly when he heard the words. "Yes, Great Elder." The disciples of the Shenquan sect behind the Great Elder said at the same time and stopped talking. Under Luohi's lead, the group of people of the Shenquan sect entered the Cloud Feather Palace together. "Sect Master, the disciples of the Shenquan sect have been brought here." Luohi entered the Cloud Feather Palace and said to Chu Fengmian respectfully before retreating to the side. "Sect Master?" The disciples of the Shenquan sect looked at Chu Fengmian when they heard the name. They sized up Chu Fengmian's realm and their eyes were filled with surprise. It seemed that he did not expect that the Sword Dao sect master was actually a half-step celestial realm martial artist. Outside of the Sword Dao sect, it had always been the Sword Slayer King, Luohi, and the others who were in charge of contacting the other sections. When they needed experts, the Mad Dragon Emperor would also act. As for the sect master, Chu Fengmian, he was mysterious and unfathomable. Apart from the 7 great sects of the 9 regions, only the people from the 5 great sects had seen him before. However, the 5 major sects had been completely destroyed by Chu Fengmian. Not a single disciple survived. Therefore, there were many rumors about the Sword Dao sect master. However, no one expected that Chu Fengmian was not even a celestial realm warrior. After the initial shock, many of the Shenquan sect disciples revealed looks of disdain and contempt. "This old man is the Great Elder of the Shenquan sect. Greetings, sect leader of the Kendo sect." The Great Elder of the Shenquan sect glanced at Chu Fengmian and said flatly. He said that he was paying his respects, but there was no respect in his tone. As for the disciples of the Shenquan sect behind him, they only glanced at Chu Fengmian and did not say a word. This made the eyes of the people of the Kendo sect a little unfriendly. However, since Chu Fengmian did not say anything, they did not say anything either. Is this how the so-called greeting is supposed to be? Chu Fengmian glanced at the group of Shenquan sect disciples and said slowly. "Since you are so insincere, please get lost." Chu Fengmian could also tell at a glance that this group of Shenquan sect disciples did not come with good intentions. Therefore, Chu Fengmian did not need to be polite to them. "Boy, what do you mean by this?" Upon hearing Chu Fengmian's words, a disciple of the Shenquan sect suddenly stepped forward and looked at Chu Fengmian coldly. "You are just a kid who is half a step into the celestial realm. You haven't even stepped into the celestial realm. What makes you worthy of us paying our respects? Today, we have already given you enough face by coming to the Origin Sword world. You don't have to put on airs here as the sect master. There are hundreds of people in our Shenquan sect who are only half a step into the celestial realm. Who do you think you are?" The words of the Shenquan sect disciple were simply provoking Chu Fengmian. However, the first elder of the Shenquan sect in front of him did not stop the Shenquan sect disciple and let him continue speaking. As soon as his voice fell, the faces of Mad Dragon Emperor, Hanueli, Luoshi, and the others suddenly burst out with a bit of killing intent. This did not look like a greeting at all. It was more like a direct provocation. Presumptuous. How rude. You are courting death. Without waiting for Chu Fengmian's reply, Mad Dragon Emperor shouted coldly. A stream of dragon power condensed in the palm of his hand and suddenly turned into a dragon claw. He slammed it down and directly bombarded the Shenquan sect disciple. Chu Fengmian was the sect master of the Sword Dao sect. Now that the disciple of the Shenquan sect had come to provoke Chu Fengmian, he was basically provoking the entire Sword Dao sect. How could he tolerate this? Mad Dragon Emperor shouted angrily and slammed the dragon claw down fiercely. Mad Dragon Emperor, you are also a celestial realm expert. Don't you think it is too much to attack a junior? The moment the dragon claw slammed down, the first elder of the Shenquan sect also made his move. A stream of spiritual power suddenly appeared in his hand and turned into a barrier in front of the Shenquan sect disciple, blocking the dragon claw. Too much? How dare he challenge my dignity? Killing him is too easy for him. Luo Shi, capture him, strip him of his essence and blood, and throw him outside the main hall to kneel. Chu Fengmian snorted coldly. His voice was incomparably dignified, like a command of the truth. There was no room for doubt. The moment she heard Chu Fengmian's words, Luo Shi made her move. A stream of chaotic energy condensed from her hand and blasted out, turning into an invisible giant hand that suddenly grabbed at the disciple of the Shenquan sect. Not good. The disciple of the Shenquan sect who had previously provoked Luo Shi changed his expression when he saw her move. He instinctively felt that something was wrong. He felt that Luo Shi's strength was not something he could match. Seeing the invisible giant hand grabbing at him, the disciple of the Shenquan sect hurriedly shouted. "First Elder, save me! Stop!" The First Elder of the Shenquan sect did not expect that there would be another Celestial Realm expert. According to the rumors in the 9 regions, the Mad Dragon Emperor was the only Celestial Realm expert in the Sword Dao sect. Therefore, he came this time without fear. His strength was not below that of the Mad Dragon Emperor. Even if the Mad Dragon Emperor attacked, he was not afraid. Especially when he saw that Chu Fengmian was only a half-step Celestial Realm expert, he felt that Chu Fengmian was just a puppet of the Mad Dragon Emperor. The Sword Dao sect had already fallen into the hands of the Mad Dragon Emperor. He naturally did not put Chu Fengmian in his eyes, so he allowed the disciple of the Shenquan sect to provoke Chu Fengmian. But now that he saw Luo Shi make a move, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. Just as he was about to withdraw to save the disciple, Luo Shi's invisible hand had already grasped the disciple of the Shenquan sect in the palm of her hand. Chapter 2138. Die! The Shenquan sect disciple was caught in the palm of Luo Shi's invisible hand, and his body immediately exploded. Bang! The Shenquan sect disciple was crushed to death in Luo Shi's hand, without the slightest ability to fight back. With Luo Shi's current Celestial Realm, it was easy for him to kill a half-step Celestial Realm warrior. The Shenquan sect's great elder didn't even have time to save him before he saw the Shenquan sect disciple being killed in the air. There was no sign of life, and he died on the spot. Mad Dragon Emperor, what is the meaning of your Sword Dao sect? The Shenquan sect's great elder's eyes were filled with shock and anger. He was surprised that there was a second Celestial Realm expert in the Sword Dao sect. Luo Shi was also one of the deputy sect masters of the Sword Dao sect. He had heard of him before, but it was rumored that Luo Shi was only a half-step Celestial Realm expert. However, the strength that Luo Shi had just unleashed was definitely the strength of a Celestial Realm expert. Unknowingly, there was another Celestial Realm expert in the Sword Dao sect. This made him suddenly feel that the Sword Dao sect's strength was still hidden. The one who was angry was that the Shenquan sect disciple was directly killed by Luo Shi. Luo Shi had no intention of showing any mercy when he attacked. The Shenquan sect disciples he brought this time were the most outstanding Shenquan sect's holy sons. All of them were geniuses, and many of them were peerless geniuses with hopes of breaking through the celestial tribulation in the future. The Shenquan sect also wanted to show their strength by bringing them here to intimidate the Sword Dao sect, but they didn't expect that they would be killed by Luo Shi today. The Shenquan sect's great elder's face was incomparably gloomy, and his eyes were filled with boundless anger. He would never let this matter rest. Mad Dragon Emperor, don't you plan to give an explanation? You must give an explanation. Those who killed Jin Chang must be buried with him. No. It can't be that simple. The Sword Dao sect must also compensate. Let's fight. Let's fight. The Sword Dao sect actually ignored the rules and killed people directly. This was a provocation. If you don't give me an explanation. Henceforth, the Shenquan sect and the Kendo sect will be mortal enemies. The other Shenquan sect disciples also shouted loudly. The disciples of the Shenquan sect had never put the Sword Dao sect in their eyes. Their eyes were filled with killing intent as they looked at Luo Shi. They couldn't wait to avenge Jin Chang. However, due to the strength that Luo Shi had just displayed, no one dared to make a move. Mad Dragon Emperor, your Sword Dao sect must give us an explanation today. The great elder of the Shenquan sect said coldly when he saw that the Mad Dragon Emperor did not reply. If you don't give me an explanation, just wait for the war to start. The Mad Dragon Emperor looked at the great elder of the Shenquan sect coldly without saying a word. Chu Feng Mian was here, so it was not his turn to speak. He just looked at the great elder of the Shenquan sect as if he was looking at a dead man. Explain? What explanation? A mere disciple of the Shenquan sect dares to provoke me? Death is not to be regretted. Chu Feng Mian, who was sitting on the throne, said coldly. As for you, it seems that you don't want to live today. You want to start a war? Today, all of you will die here. Chu Feng Mian looked at the great elder of the Shenquan sect, and the killing intent in his voice was undisguised. These disciples of the Shenquan sect had just entered the origin world, and their movements were under Chu Feng Mian's control. Naturally, he knew that these people were not of good origin. If these Shenquan sect had come politely, Chu Feng Mian would have given them some face. But since they had directly provoked him, Chu Feng Mian naturally wouldn't give them any face. As for the so-called war, Chu Feng Mian didn't care at all since only one of the 3 celestial realm experts of the Shenquan sect was an immoral general. Given Chu Feng Mian's strength, he could easily kill an immoral general. As for the remaining 2 celestial realm experts, for example, Chu Feng Mian didn't even need to do anything to the great elder of the Shenquan sect. Han Yueli and Luo Shi could kill him. Chu Feng Mian had never taken the Shenquan sect seriously, and he was fearless. The great elder of the Shenquan sect threatened to start a war, but Chu Feng Mian didn't care at all. You've been spying for so long. It's time to come out. Chu Feng Mian didn't wait for the great elder of the Shenquan sect to speak. He suddenly shouted towards the outside of the hall. Boom! The moment Chu Feng Mian's voice rang out, a figure suddenly condensed outside the hall. This figure was extremely tall and slowly condensed into a white-haired old man, who walked into the hall. Ancestor. Upon seeing the white-haired old man, the great elder of the Shenquan sect and all the disciples of the Shenquan sect bowed respectfully. The white-haired old man was the strongest expert of the Shenquan sect, as well as the ancestor of the Shenquan sect, Ancestor Holy Spring. Chu Feng Mian had long discovered that someone had been spying on the Sword Dao sect and had even secretly infiltrated the sect. It was impossible for an immortal general to hide from Chu Feng Mian and sneak into the Sword Dao sect without anyone noticing. Chu Feng Mian was in the origin sword world. Even a profound heaven realm immortal marquis wouldn't be able to hide from Chu Feng Mian's eyes, let alone an immortal general. Ancestor Holy Spring was a little surprised when he was called out by Chu Feng Mian. After all, he was an immortal general expert, so he didn't put the Sword Dao sect in his eyes at all. He sneaked in quietly for 2 reasons. Firstly, he wanted to find the upper sword execution order chart. Secondly, he wanted to probe the Sword Dao sect's strength. He hadn't expected that he'd been exposed long ago. Now that Chu Feng Mian had called him out, there was no need for him to continue hiding. He directly showed himself. Ancestor, Jing Chan was killed by that person. Ancestor, please avenge us. A Shenquan sect disciple walked out and pointed at Luo Shi when he saw Ancestor Holy Spring arrive. Ancestor Holy Spring's arrival made them even more arrogant. He was an immortal general expert, and one of the few immortal generals in the 9 domains. The Shenquan sect had been able to occupy one of the 9 domains and establish their own sect precisely because of the deterrence of an immortal general expert like Ancestor Holy Spring. Previously, the 5 great sects hadn't dared to establish their own sect in the 9 domains even though they'd joined forces. Instead, they'd chosen a small world near the 9 domains. There were no weaklings among the sects that could establish their own sect in the 9 domains. None of the Shenquan sect's disciples have died in vain. Old Ancestor Holy Spring nodded. His gaze swept across the crowd as he spoke in an indifferent tone. You've killed our disciples, so you should give us an explanation. Our Shenquan sect has come with friendly intentions this time. If we don't give you an explanation for the deaths of our disciples, it wouldn't be right. Chapter 2139. When old ancestor Holy Spring arrived at the palace, he immediately probed the strength of everyone in the Sword Dao sect. He could see that the Sword Dao sect was indeed different from the rumors. Apart from Mad Dragon Emperor, Luo Shi and Hanuel had already stepped into the Celestial Realm. Now, the Sword Dao sect had 3 Celestial Realm experts. However, the 3 demon deities who had just stepped into the Celestial Realm were nothing in his eyes. He was an immortal general. Even if there were 10 demon deities in the immortal realm, they would not be a match for him. After probing clearly, he was even more fearless and questioned coldly. Explanation? What kind of explanation do you want? Chu Fengmian sat on the throne. Facing old ancestor Holy Spring, his expression was incomparably calm. Chu Fengmian's calm expression made old ancestor Holy Spring feel a little strange. He had probed several times, but the result was that Chu Fengmian was only in the half-step celestial realm. With his current strength, half-step celestial realm experts were no different from ants. However, not only did Chu Fengmian call out his figure, but he also looked calm when facing him. If it were other half-step celestial realm experts, they would be incomparably terrified when facing a celestial realm expert, let alone an immortal general. However, Chu Fengmian's gaze was incomparably calm. This kind of calmness was not faked, but came from the bottom of his heart. This kind of strangeness made old ancestor Holy Spring feel a little strange, but it only lasted for a moment. Soon, he became incomparably indifferent. Even if the Sword Dao sect had some tricks up their sleeves, they would be vulnerable in front of his absolute strength. It's very simple. Today, I'm only here for one thing. Hand over this thing and we can leave. From then on, all grievances will be written off. My Shenquan sect is not willing to kill the innocent. Give us an explanation and we can leave. Old ancestor Holy Spring stared at Chu Fengmian and said, "Let bygones be bygones. Not willing to kill the innocent? Old man, if you want the sword execution order portrait, you don't have to be so righteous." Hearing old ancestor Holy Spring's words, Chu Fengmian laughed. The purpose of the Shenquan sect's visit to the Sword Dao sect was obvious. It was for the sword execution order portrait. Old ancestor Holy Spring's words were so righteous. He sword execution order portrait, what did he want? It seems like you're a sensible person. Since that's the case, I won't waste any more words with you. Old ancestor Holy Spring said Chu Fengmian's didn't beat around the bush. Hand over the upper sword execution order chart and I'll forget about what happened today. Sword Dao sect has a sexes. Chu Fengmian sat on the throne and looked at ancestor Holy Spring with a relaxed expression. He even waved his hand and a cup of hot tea fell into his hand. While drinking, he spoke casually. What if I don't agree? If you don't agree, don't blame my Sacred Spring sect for being merciless. Old ancestor Holy Spring stared at Chu Fengmian. He couldn't see through Chu Fengmian at all. Chu Fengmian didn't show any fear under his threat. He didn't look like a half-step celestial being at all. But today, he was determined to get the sword execution order portrait. Even if Chu Fengmian was strange, he wouldn't give up. It sounds scary. Unfortunately, it's just a small Shenquan sect. So what if I'm ruthless? It's just a little more blood on my hands. Chu Fengmian finished his tea and said slowly. Old ancestor, don't waste your breath on this boy. A small Sword Dao sect dares to kill a disciple of our Shenquan sect. It's a capital offense. It's not enough to kill the entire Sword Dao sect. The great elder of the Shenquan sect suddenly said to old ancestor Holy Spring. I'll give you one last chance, boy. Hand over the sword execution order portrait. Old ancestor Holy Spring glared at Chu Fengmian with boundless killing intent. Immortal force was also condensing on his body. He was ready to strike at any time and sweep away everything with his tyrannical power. The sword execution order portrait is here. Come and get it if you have the ability. Chu Fengmian moved his palm and an ancient portrait emerged in front of him. It was the Sword Execution Order portrait. The Sword Execution Order portrait. The moment Old Ancestor Holy Spring saw the ancient map, his eyes were filled with endless greed. Although this was the first time the Holy Spring Patriarch had seen the Upper Sword Execution Token chart, he was certain that this was the Upper Sword Execution Token chart the moment he sensed the sword intent on it. The Sword Execution Order portrait was related to the inheritance of the Sword Dao sect. Its value was immeasurable. "Give it to me." Boom! The moment he saw the portrait, Old Ancestor Holy Spring made his move. Immortal force erupted from his body like the birth of a true dragon. It swept down and grabbed at the Sword Execution Order portrait. This burst of celestial spiritual energy rushed toward the throne. The target of this celestial spiritual energy wasn't just the Sword Execution Token, it was also Chu Fengmian. Old Ancestor Holy Spring didn't just want to take the Sword Execution Order portrait, he also wanted to kill Chu Fengmian. Watch out! Mad Dragon Emperor, Hanueli, and Luo Shu were ready to support Chu Fengmian when they saw Old Ancestor Holy Spring make his move. However, they didn't expect Old Ancestor Holy Spring to be so much faster than them. He arrived in front of Chu Fengmian far ahead of them. Immortal force erupted from his body and condensed into a palm that came crashing down. "You're courting death." Sitting on the throne, Chu Fengmian's expression didn't change in the slightest when he saw the immortal power bombarding him. He just slowly raised his hand, and with a bang, a surge of dragon power condensed in his palm, and slammed down from the sky. A battle dragon claw formed above Chu Fengmian's head and swept down. The immortal force of Old Ancestor Holy Spring was shattered by the battle dragon claw. Not only did the battle dragon claw shatter Old Ancestor Holy Spring's immortal force, but it also came crashing down on him. Holy Spring True Body. Old Ancestor Holy Spring let out a long roar. His body grew several times bigger, and his whole body was covered in a golden color. It was a secret technique of body refining that was being used. Body refining Dao? Let's see if your body is tougher, or if my sword is sharper. Chu Fengmian suddenly made his move. He unsheathed the ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and ruthlessly slashed out a stream of sword chi. It slashed through the air and aimed at Old Ancestor Holy Spring. Hiss! Everyone could hear the sound of the sword chi tearing the space apart. The moment the sword light was unleashed, it slashed at Old Ancestor Holy Spring's chest. Crack! The first layer of Old Ancestor Holy Spring's golden body emitted a cracking sound. In the next moment, it shattered, and blood splattered everywhere. First, set a small target. For example, 1 second. Remember, book guest residence. Chapter 2140. Blood spurted out from Old Ancestor Holy Spring's body in the air. There was a cut on Old Ancestor Holy Spring's chest. How is this possible? The disciples of the Shenquan sect were stunned at the scene. They were speechless for a moment, and their eyes widened in disbelief. The old ancestor of the Shenquan sect, an invincible immortal general, was wounded by Chu Fengmian's sword. How could they not be shocked? They were all dumbfounded. Even Hanueli, Luo Shi, Mad Dragon Emperor, and the others who had seen Chu Fengmian in action before were stunned as they stared blankly at the scene. Who the hell are you? Old Ancestor Holy Spring kept retreating. The wound on his chest was quickly healed. With his strength, the wound could be healed in an instant, but the sword just now could not erase it. He could not resist the power of the sword even with his full strength. Instead, he was injured. The invincible golden body he had painstakingly condensed was broken by the sword. His invincible golden body had been painstakingly condensed using countless treasures. With this invincible golden body, Old Ancestor Holy Spring could be considered an expert among the demon immortals at the Immortal General Realm. But under Chu Fengmian's sword, the invincible golden body was so fragile. Old Ancestor Holy Spring's expression changed dramatically. He looked at Chu Fengmian like a monster. Old Ancestor Holy Spring could clearly see that Chu Fengmian was only a half-step celestial being. That realm was not fake, but Chu Fengmian's current strength was not something a half-step celestial being could possess. All of this stunned Old Ancestor Holy Spring for a moment. "I'm the one who will send you to your death." While Old Ancestor Holy Spring was still in shock, Chu Fengmian, who was sitting on the throne, suddenly waved his spiritual sword. Another sword light was launched at Old Ancestor Holy Spring. Anyone who dared to snatch the sword enforcer token illustration would be Chu Fengmian's mortal enemy. Since Old Ancestor Holy Spring wanted to be the first to stand out, Chu Fengmian would kill him first to establish his prestige. Even though this battle was taking place in the Sword Origin world, the battle was still ongoing. Chu Fengmian also felt that countless spiritual consciousnesses were transmitted from the distant space, watching the battle. Elder Holy Spring was not the only one who coveted the Sword Executor illustration. The inheritance of the Upper Sword sect could cause countless experts of the 9 regions to fight for it. However, before they were certain of Chu Fengmian's strength, these people would not act rashly. Today, Chu Fengmian wanted to kill Old Ancestor Holy Spring and establish his prestige. By then, the other immortal generals would have to think twice before snatching the Upper Sword Execution Order chart from Chu Fengmian's hands. Forefather Holy Spring must die today. At the same time, an invincible sword will rose from Chu Fengmian's back the moment the sword was slashed out. The sword will condensed on the edge of the sword and burst out with even more power than the previous sword. Go! Flawless. Forefather Sacred Spring let out a long howl. When he saw the sword coming, he instantly turned around and vanished without a trace. He suddenly flew out of the Sword Origin world. He knew that he had underestimated Chu Fengmian this time. He had rashly entered the Sword Origin boundary, which was Chu Fengmian's lair. If they were in the outside world, he still had the ability to fight Chu Fengmian. However, in the Sword Origin boundary, with the help of the Sword Origin boundary's origin energy, he would undoubtedly die if he fought Chu Fengmian. Run! Seeing Old Ancestor Holy Spring flee, the Grand Elder of the Shenquan sect led the other Shenquan sect disciples to turn tail and flee as well. They activated an escape light and flew out of the Sword Origin boundary. Chu Fengmian coldly watched all of this and shouted coldly. "No one from the Shenquan sect can leave. Kill them all." "Yes." Hanueli, Luoshi, and Mad Dragon Emperor responded. Immediately, an escape light burst out and chased after the Shenquan sect disciples. Each of them executed countless killing moves to kill the Shenquan sect disciples. Mad Dragon Emperor stopped the Grand Elder of the Shenquan sect by himself. As for Hanueli and Luoshi, they rushed into the crowd. These half-step Celestial Realm Shenquan sect disciples were powerless in front of the two of them and were easily killed. As for Chu Fengmian, he was still sitting on the throne. His gaze seemed to be able to see through countless spaces. Chu Fengmian's gaze locked onto Ancestor Holy Spring, who had disappeared under the layers of space. "Since you're here, there's no need to leave," Chu Fengmian said in an indifferent tone. Although Chu Fengmian's tone was calm, anyone could hear the murderous intent in his tone. This was a killing intent. Chu Fengmian had to kill Old Ancestor Holy Spring. Origin Source Suppression. As Chu Fengmian spoke, he slowly raised his hand and pressed down with his palm facing down. Rumble. Suddenly, a violent and boundless power erupted in the sky above the Origin Sword world. Streaks of 7-colored light, which had been hidden in the sky above the Origin Sword world, suddenly appeared. These streaks of 7-colored light were like a huge lake that dyed the entire sky above the Origin Sword world in a rainbow color. This was the origin source power of the Origin Source boundary. This was the first time Chu Fengmian had used the Origin Source power after upgrading the Origin Source boundary. Boundless power erupted and turned into a long dragon. Under Chu Fengmian's guidance, it rushed towards Old Ancestor Holy Spring to suppress him. This Origin Source energy was just pure strength. It didn't contain any technique. When it came crashing down, it instantly traversed countless spaces and found Old Ancestor Holy Spring. Then, all of it bombarded Old Ancestor Holy Spring. Buzz! Old Ancestor Holy Spring's body stopped in the depths of the void. It wasn't that he wanted to stop, but under the bombardment of the origin source power, he was blasted out from the depths of the void. Even if several immortal generals joined forces, they still wouldn't be able to withstand the origin energy of the sword origin world. Moreover, Old Ancestor Holy Spring had already been injured by Chu Fengmian's sword. Under the pressure of the boundless origin energy, Old Ancestor Holy Spring was already on the verge of collapsing. He was trying his best to resist the suppression of the origin energy. Suppress. Suddenly, Chu Fengmian moved. With a move of his palm, a square seal appeared in his palm and flew out. It flew above Old Ancestor Holy Spring and immediately suppressed him. The suppression of the Life Great Seal made Old Ancestor Holy Spring, who was already exhausted, unable to resist. No! Old Ancestor Holy Spring shouted loudly, but it was meaningless. His body had already been enveloped by the Life Great Seal. End of chapter. Chapter 2141. As Ancestor Holy Spring screamed, his body was suppressed by the Life Seal. His voice faded away bit by bit. Ancestor Holy Spring was suppressed in the deepest space of the Life Seal. His power was completely sealed and he could no longer escape. All the disciples of the Sword Dao sect fell silent at the sight of this. For a moment, no one spoke. Ancestor Holy Spring was a world-renowned expert in the 9 domains. He was an invincible immortal general. But now, Ancestor Holy Spring was suppressed by the Life Seal and Chu Fengmian. It should be known that suppressing an immortal general was much more difficult than killing one. This was because all immortal generals would rather self-detonate than be suppressed. Once Old Ancestor Sacred Spring was subdued, his life would be in Chu Fengmian's hands, and his life would be in the hands of Chu Fengmian. Even if he wanted to die now, he couldn't. No one could have imagined that Ancestor Holy Spring's trip to the Sword Dao sect to snatch the Upper Sword Execution Token chart would end up like this. Above the sword origin boundary, countless spiritual consciousnesses that were observing the battle and the experts behind them were stunned. They didn't expect Ancestor Holy Spring to be so weak that he would be suppressed by Chu Fengmian. All of them had speculated that even if Chu Fengmian won the battle, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. At the very least, Chu Fengmian would be injured and they would be able to seize the opportunity to snatch the Upper Sword Execution Token chart. But now, Chu Fengmian was sitting on the throne. Chu Fengmian didn't even have to make a move personally. Just the sword light that crossed thousands of miles was enough to force Ancestor Holy Spring into a desperate situation. Not a single disciple of the Sword Dao sect was injured because of this battle. It was only a matter of time before Ancestor Holy Spring was suppressed and subdued by Chu Fengmian. In the future, the Sword Dao sect would have another immortal general as a servant. The strength of the Sword Dao sect would also grow stronger because of this battle. None of them had expected this to happen. This person isn't easy to deal with. Let's go. Some experts immediately retracted their spiritual senses and stopped fighting after watching the battle. Although Old Ancestor Holy Spring wasn't considered the top among the demon immortals, he was definitely an expert. He could be considered above average. But now, Old Ancestor Holy Spring didn't have the strength to fight back. Many of them were even weaker than Forefather Holy Spring. Trying to snatch the Upper Sword Execution portrait from Chu Fengmian was tantamount to courting death. Immortal generals were all incomparably shrewd. They weren't willing to die for nothing. Old Ancestor Holy Spring was betting that the Sword Dao sect was as weak as the rumors said. That was why he had acted so rashly. But now that everyone had seen Old Ancestor Holy Spring's fate, no one dared to gamble anymore. Chu Fengmian raised his leg and looked at the sky above the origin sword world. He could sense that at least half of his spiritual consciousness had disappeared. These people had already been intimidated by Chu Fengmian and had given up on the idea of snatching the Shang Sword Execution Order chart. There was more than one Shang Sword Execution Order chart in Chu Fengmian's hand. There were a total of 12 Shang Sword execution order charts. Therefore, they might not keep an eye on Chu Fengmian. As the opening of the upper sword sect's ruins drew closer, more and more Shang Sword execution order charts would emerge. During the battle just now, Chu Fengmian had already sensed a sword radiance soaring into the sky. Among the 9 domains, another person had obtained the Shang Sword execution order chart and made it recognize him as its master. Therefore, even if some people wanted to obtain the Shang Sword execution order chart, they didn't necessarily have to obtain the one in Chu Fengmian's hand. It was just that the Sword Dao sect's strength was the weakest at the beginning. That was why so many people had gathered to spy on it. Chu Fengmian had killed old ancestor Holy Spring with the intention of displaying his strength and intimidating others. If the Shang Sword execution order chart hadn't been exposed, Chu Fengmian would have chosen to keep a low profile. But now that it had been exposed, there was no point in keeping a low profile. At this time, only strength could determine who the master of the Shang Sword execution order chart was. Of course, not all of the spectators had left. At least a third of the spectators had stayed behind to observe Chu Fengmian after witnessing the battle. These people hadn't given up yet. The Shang Sword execution order chart is right here. Whoever wants to take it, feel free to come. However, only death awaits those who dare step into the sword origin world. Chu Fengmian said indifferently as he looked outside the sword origin world. His voice wasn't loud, but everyone outside the sword origin world could hear him clearly. Chu Fengmian was confident that he would be able to keep the Shang Sword execution order chart. Although the 9 domains had gathered experts from tens of thousands of star domains, there were still very few immortal generals. Generally, only one immortal general expert would be born in a second-grade star domain. Inside the sword origin world, Chu Fengmian didn't fear the combined might of several immortal generals by relying on the origin power of the sword origin world. Chu Fengmian's words had been heard clearly by the spies outside the sword origin world. Humph! A half-step sky-human brat dares to provoke an immortal general by relying on the origin power of a sacred land? We brothers want the Shang Sword execution order chart. Suddenly, a cold snort sounded. 2 streaks of light suddenly stepped into the sword origin world from outside. These 2 figures looked very similar. They were a pair of brothers. However, their clothes were completely different. They were both wearing long robes, but one was black and the other was white. The black and white young lords? Gasps of surprise sounded outside the sword origin world when they saw the 2. As expected, this pair of brothers are determined to obtain the upper sword execution token illustration. These 2 are both experts of the Sword Dao. It's not strange that they want to obtain the inheritance of the sword sect. The origin power of the sacred land isn't easy to deal with. I feel that even if the black and white young lords join forces, they might not be able to resist the origin power. Why would they dare to make a move? I don't know. However, the 2 of them are from the incomparably ancient Black and White Sword sect. The Black and White Sword sect's history can be traced back to hundreds of thousands of years ago. Perhaps they have some unknown method to deal with the origin power. The experts discussed with each other as they watched the battle. Many of them didn't give up on the Shang Sword execution order chart. The Black and White young lords also wanted to see Chu Fengmian's true strength. After all, when Chu Fengmian suppressed Ancestor Holy Spring, it was too easy. It seemed that he hadn't even used his full strength. They wanted to know Chu Fengmian's true strength so that they could think of a way to deal with him. Furthermore, they were also waiting for an opportunity. If the Black and White young lords were to fight Chu Fengmian to a draw, they would definitely make a move and reap the benefits. End of chapter. You're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.